Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Haunting Whispers. I'm aware that many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I thought it would be a fun idea if each of you could leave a comment letting me know which part of the world you're listening from. Also, give a like and subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying the episodes. Okay, let's get comfortable, relax, and begin. It started last April when I saw the listing for Sunflower Haven Farm Commune. My life in Seattle had become a suffocating routine of tech work and isolation, so when I read about their sustainable farming community in rural Idaho, it seemed like exactly what I needed. The website showed smiling people tending organic gardens, sharing meals in a restored barn, and living what looked like an idyllic life away from the rat race. The application process was surprisingly thorough. Video interviews, background checks, and a detailed questionnaire about my beliefs in sustainable living. When I was accepted, Sarah, the commune leader, called personally to welcome me. Her warm, motherly voice made me feel instantly at ease. "We choose our new members carefully," she explained. "We're like a family here." I arrived on a crisp spring morning, driving down a long dirt road lined with towering corn stalks. The main house was a sprawling farmhouse painted sunshine yellow, surrounded by neat rows of vegetables and flowers. Sarah met me at the entrance, her silver hair gleaming in the sunlight, wearing a flowing dress decorated with embroidered sunflowers. She hugged me like a long-lost daughter. There were 23 other members, all of whom had joined within the last year. We each had small but comfortable rooms in the main house or converted barn. The daily routine was simple. Wake at dawn, tend the fields, prepare communal meals, and spend evenings in group activities. Everyone seemed genuinely happy. The first strange thing I noticed was how insistent they were about the full moon ceremonies. "It's our most sacred time," Sarah explained. "When the moon is full, the earth's energy is strongest. That's when we give thanks for our abundance." The ceremonies were held in the cornfield, where we'd gather in white robes to sing and dance. It seemed a bit theatrical, but I went along with it. 5 new members had joined with me that spring. By the third full moon, they had all disappeared. When I asked about them, Sarah said they'd left to pursue other paths, but their rooms looked untouched, personal belongings still in place. One night, I found a journal belonging to Amy, one of the missing members. The last entry read, "Something's wrong. The chanting from the barn at night. The symbols carved into the cornfield." Sarah's eyes during the ceremonies. "They're not human." I started paying closer attention. The older members always ate separately from us newer arrivals. They prepared our food, insisting on generous portions and special blessed herbs. I began noticing how they watched us eat, their eyes gleaming with an unsettling intensity. We newer members were all gaining weight, our bodies becoming softer, slower. During the 4th full moon ceremony, I hung back, pretending to feel ill. Once the singing started, I slipped into the barn. The sweet, cloying scent of incense filled the air. In the corner, partially hidden by hay bales, I found a trap door. The metal hinges were new, incongruous against the weathered wood. My flashlight beam revealed steep stairs descending into darkness. The air grew colder as I crept down. The underground chamber was vast, carved into the earth itself. Ancient-looking symbols covered the walls, similar to the ones I'd seen in the cornfields. But it was what stood in the center that made my blood freeze, a massive stone altar, its surface stained dark and surrounded by smaller stone tables arranged in a perfect circle. 27 indentations were carved into the floor in a spiral pattern. 12 were filled with bundles wrapped in white cloth. I heard footsteps above and quickly retreated, but not before glimpsing something that still haunts me: photographs pinned to one wall, showing previous members arranged in ritual poses, their bodies positioned to form complex patterns. In every photo, Sarah stood in the center, but she looked exactly the same in each one, though the earliest photos appeared decades old. That night I couldn't sleep. The chanting from the barn grew louder, more frenzied. Through my window I saw flickering lights in the cornfield. Shadows moved in impossible ways. The cornstalks swayed without wind, whispering secrets in voices that sounded almost human. I started planning my escape, but they watched us constantly. The roads were patrolled. Our phones had mysteriously stopped working weeks ago. I learned from overheard conversations that the final ceremony would be at the harvest moon, when 12 chosen ones would complete the spiral. The soil demanded sacrifice for fertility, they said. The underground temple needed to be fed. Last night, I found a note slipped under my door. Tomorrow night, the spiral will be complete. The paper was stained with something dark that smelled metallic. Through my wall, I could hear my neighbor weeping softly. I'm writing this now, hiding in the root cellar. The harvest moon rises tonight. I can hear them preparing above, singing, laughing, sharpening things. Sarah's voice carries above the others, reciting words in a language that makes my teeth ache. The growing darkness feels alive, hungry. There's a tunnel down here, ancient and half-collapsed, that might lead to the highway. I have to try. If you're reading this, it means I either made it out or, well, but you need to know what's happening here. The photos I found went back to 1922. Every harvest moon, 12 new members. Every year, Sarah looking exactly the same. The soil here is the darkest I've ever seen, and everything grows huge, twisted, wrong. They're coming down the cellar steps now. The boards are creaking overhead. Sarah is calling my name in that warm, motherly voice, but there's something else beneath it, something old and hungry that has worn her skin for a very long time. I have to go. If you're thinking of joining a commune, do your research. Check the soil, count the members, and whatever you do, stay away from Idaho during the harvest moon. Remember, some harvests feed on more than just corn. You think that was scary? The next story might just make you check under your bed. The brochure made Whispering Pines Lodge look perfect, a charming family-run resort nestled in the Colorado Rockies, complete with hiking trails and stunning mountain views. As a travel blogger, I was excited to review this hidden gem, especially since they'd offered me a complimentary weekend stay. What caught my attention was how few reviews I could find online for such a beautiful property. The handful that existed were from years ago, all posted within the same month. I arrived on a Friday afternoon in late September. The autumn air was crisp, and golden aspen leaves danced in the breeze. The main lodge was an impressive 3-story log cabin with a massive stone fireplace that stretched up through all floors. Mrs. Henderson, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and kind eyes, greeted me at reception. "Welcome to Whispering Pines. We're so pleased to have you." She smiled warmly, but something felt off about it. "You're just in time. We're expecting a full house this weekend. 45 guests total, our biggest group in years." As she handed me my room key, her fingers brushed against mine. They were ice cold. I noticed her hands were shaking slightly. "The trails are beautiful this time of year," she continued, "but please stick to the marked paths. The mountains can be unpredictable." My room was on the 3rd floor, with a beautiful view of the surrounding forest. The furniture was rustic but comfortable, though the floorboards creaked with every step. As I unpacked, I heard whispers coming through the heating vent, probably just other guests. I told myself, though I couldn't make out any words. That evening, I joined the welcome dinner in the main dining room. The food was excellent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The staff kept exchanging worried glances. Mr. Henderson, the owner, gave a brief welcome speech that seemed rehearsed, almost mechanical. His eyes never quite met those of his audience. "Tomorrow's weather will be perfect for hiking," he announced. "We encourage everyone to explore our trails. The autumn colors are spectacular this time of year." His voice caught on the last few words. That night, I woke to the sound of chanting. It was faint, coming from somewhere in the woods. The digital clock read 3:33 a.m. When I looked out my window, I saw flickering lights moving through the trees, like a procession of torches. I grabbed my phone to record it, but the battery was completely drained. Strange, since I'd charged it before bed. The next morning at breakfast, 3 guests were missing. "Oh, they must have gone for an early hike," Mrs. Henderson said quickly when someone asked. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. I decided to explore the property. The trails were well maintained but oddly arranged. They seemed to form patterns when viewed on the trail map. As I walked, I noticed strange symbols carved into tree trunks. They looked old, but some appeared freshly cut. Around noon, I heard screaming from deeper in the woods. I ran toward the sound, but it suddenly stopped. That's when I found the first body. It was positioned in a bizarre way, woven through the branches of a pine tree, limbs twisted at impossible angles. The victim's face was frozen in terror. Before I could process what I was seeing, I heard rustling behind me. When I turned, there was nothing there, except for a pattern of branches on the ground that hadn't been there moments before. I ran back to the lodge, but the Hendersons were gone. The other guests were panicking. More people had disappeared. We tried calling for help, but there was no cell service, and the landlines were dead. The cars in the parking lot wouldn't start. As the sun set, we heard the chanting again, louder this time. Through the lobby windows, we saw figures moving in the tree line, tall, impossibly thin shapes that seemed to bend with the trees. The remaining guests huddled together in the main room. Someone found an old journal hidden behind a loose panel in the fireplace. The entries detailed a blood pact made generations ago between the Henderson family and something that lived in these mountains. Every 50 years, the lodge had to provide 15 souls. This was the 50th year. The lights went out. In the darkness, we heard the main doors burst open. The wind that rushed in carried whispers in a language none of us recognized. One by one, people started disappearing from the room. I felt cold hands grab my ankles, but somehow, I broke free. Only 3 of us survived that night. We made it to the highway by dawn, running through the woods as branches reached for us, and whispers followed our every step. The police found no bodies, no evidence of struggle. The lodge itself had vanished. In its place was an overgrown clearing that looked untouched for decades. Sometimes I dream about that weekend. In my nightmares, I see the trees moving, branches twisting into those same symbols I saw on the trail. I've tried researching the Henderson family, but it's like they never existed. The only proof I have is a single photo I took when I arrived, but the image changes every time I look at it. The lodge looks older, more sinister, and in one of the third-floor windows, there's a face I don't remember seeing before. Last week, I received a letter. Inside was a new brochure for Whispering Pines Lodge, advertising its grand reopening under new management. The photos show the same beautiful building, the same stunning views, but now I know what hides behind that perfect facade, and I know that in 50 years, it will happen again. I wanted to warn others, but the brochure crumbled to dust in my hands. All that remained was a single pine needle and 3 words written in what looked like dried blood. See you soon. If you're still breathing easy, you won't be after this next tale. It was my first week as the new pastor at St. Michael's Church in Burlington, Vermont. The old stone building had stood there since the 1700s, its bell tower reaching up into the crisp autumn sky like a finger pointing to heaven. I'd been excited about this position, my first time leading my own congregation. But that was before I found the first body. I remember that Tuesday evening clearly. The choir had just finished practice, and I was doing my usual walkthrough of the church before locking up. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the stained glass windows. Something felt off about the silence. It was too heavy, too thick. That's when I heard it. A soft humming coming from somewhere below the church. At first, I thought maybe someone had left a phone or radio on, but as I followed the sound, it led me to an old wooden door near the altar that I'd never noticed before. It was partially hidden behind a tapestry, the wood worn smooth with age. The key I found in my ring of church keys shouldn't have fit, but it did. The door opened with a groan that echoed through the empty church. Stone steps led down into darkness. Using my phone as a flashlight, I started descending. The humming grew louder with each step. The air became thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something metallic. The beam of my phone light revealed rough stone walls covered in strange symbols carved directly into the rock. They looked ancient, but something about them seemed wrong, unnatural. At the bottom of the stairs, the passage opened into a large chamber. My light caught something reflective in the center, a brass bell, much smaller than the one in the tower above, sitting on a stone altar. Around it, arranged in a perfect circle, were 13 wooden chairs. And in one of those chairs sat Sarah Miller, our lead soprano. She was still wearing her choir robe, her head slumped forward, hands folded neatly in her lap. For a moment, I thought she had fallen asleep. But when I touched her shoulder, her skin was cold. I called the police immediately, but what happened next only deepened the mystery. The medical examiner couldn't determine a cause of death. There wasn't a mark on her body. It was as if she had simply stopped living. That's when I started digging into the church's history. The founding families of Burlington had built St. Michael's shortly after the Salem witch trials. Many of them had fled Massachusetts, claiming they wanted to escape the hysteria. But what I found in the church records painted a different picture. Every year since the church's founding, people had disappeared, always in groups of 12, always over the course of a year. The 13th chair was meant for the witness, someone to carry on the tradition. I should have left then, should have run as far as I could, but I couldn't abandon my congregation. More choir members began to vanish, one each month, their bodies appearing in that underground chamber, arranged in increasingly disturbing patterns that formed symbols I recognized from the walls. The police were baffled, no signs of forced entry, no evidence of struggle. It was as if these people had walked willingly to their deaths, and maybe they had. During services, I started noticing things, the way certain families would exchange knowing glances during hymns, how they would linger after Mass, whispering in corners. The archives revealed that these families, the ones whose names appeared again and again in church records, had indeed fled the witch trials. Not out of innocence, but guilt. They had brought something with them, something that demanded sacrifice. Last night, everything came to a head. During evening Mass, as I stood at the pulpit, the small brass bell from the crypt began to ring. Not the church bell above, this was different, deeper, wrong. The doors slammed shut on their own. The lights flickered and died. In the darkness, I heard singing. Not hymns, but something older, something that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. The congregation didn't scream or panic. They sat perfectly still, their eyes reflecting the dim light, like animals. I'm writing this now from my office, where I've barricaded myself. The singing hasn't stopped. Every few minutes I hear footsteps in the hallway, slow, measured steps coming closer. The brass bell keeps ringing, calling them, calling me. The sun will rise soon. Maybe then I'll find an empty church, convince myself this was all a nightmare. But I can hear them gathering outside my door now, their voices joining the ancient song. And despite my terror, despite everything I've seen, part of me wants to open that door. Part of me wants to answer the bell's call. If you're reading this, stay away from St. Michael's Church. The bell tower's shadow falls far beyond its walls, and some traditions never die. They just hunger for new witnesses to carry them forward. And if you hear singing in the night, soft and sweet and wrong, don't listen, don't follow. And whatever you do, don't look back at the church as you run. You might see what's really been hiding in that bell tower all these years, waiting for the next witness to take their seat in that 13th chair. The chills you feel now are nothing compared to what's coming next. It was the summer of 2018, and I had just moved to Little Rock, Arkansas, for a teaching job at the local high school. The heat was unbearable that July, pushing past 95 degrees most days. My colleague Sarah mentioned a swimming hole called Red Creek, about 30 minutes outside town where the locals like to cool off. She said it was beautiful, deep, and always refreshing, even in the worst heat waves. I remember the first time I visited Red Creek. The water looked inviting, crystal clear near the edges but deep blue in the center where it dropped off suddenly. Old oak trees hung over the water, their branches creating patches of shade on the surface. A rope swing dangled from one of the thicker branches, worn smooth from years of use. The locals seemed friendly enough, though something felt off about how they watched me. An older man, probably in his 70s, asked if I was new in town. When I said yes, he just nodded slowly and walked away, whispering something to his wife. I didn't think much of it at the time. I started going to Red Creek regularly after work. The water was perfect, cool, and clean. But things began to change when August approached. First, I noticed how the local teenagers would never swim past the halfway point of the creek. They stayed in the shallows, laughing and splashing, but their eyes kept darting toward the deeper water. One evening, I was swimming alone, something I probably shouldn't have done, but the heat made me reckless. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the water. That's when I heard it, a sound like singing but not quite. It was more like humming, coming from somewhere beneath the surface. I told myself it was just the current, but deep down, I knew better. The next day at school, I asked Sarah about the creek's history. Her face changed, just slightly, but enough for me to notice. She mentioned something about local legends, about how the creek got its name. According to her, every 7 years, during the August full moon, the water would turn red. She laughed it off, saying it was probably just algae or minerals in the soil. But then the disappearances started. First it was Tommy Henderson, a junior from my English class. They found his towel and phone by the creek, but no sign of him. A week later, Jessica Martinez vanished the same way. The police dragged the creek but found nothing. The water was too deep, they said, with underground caves and currents that made searching impossible. The town felt different after that. People stopped going to the creek, except for a group of older residents who would gather there at dusk. I watched them once, hidden behind a tree. They stood in a circle at the water's edge, chanting something in voices too low for me to hear. By the time the August full moon came around, 5 more teenagers had disappeared. That night, I couldn't sleep. Something pulled me back to Red Creek. I know it was stupid, but I had to know what was happening. The moon cast enough light to see by when I arrived. The water wasn't blue anymore. It had taken on a reddish tinge that made my stomach turn. As I stood there, the humming started again, louder this time. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then I saw them, bodies floating to the surface, one by one. 7 of them, all the missing teenagers. But something was wrong. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, and their eyes were open, glowing with a faint blue light. The town elders were there too, watching from the shore. They didn't seem surprised. One of them, the old man who had first spoken to me, turned and saw me. "It's been this way for generations," he said quietly. "The spirit in the water keeps our town safe, but it needs to feed. 7 young souls every 7 years. Better them than all of us." I left town the next day, gave up my teaching job, broke my lease, and drove until Red Creek was far behind me. But sometimes, on full moon nights, I still hear that humming, and when I close my eyes, I see those glowing blue eyes staring up at me from the depths. The police never found any evidence of what happened. The official report listed the teenagers as drowning victims, tragic accidents in a dangerous swimming hole. The creek still runs clear most of the time, but locals say that every 7 years, under the August full moon, the water turns red again. I've tried to convince myself it was all in my head, the humming, the glowing eyes, the town elders' ritual, but I know what I saw, and I know that something ancient and hungry still lives in the depths of Red Creek, waiting for the next 7th summer, when the water will run red once more. They closed the swimming hole after that summer, put up warning signs and fences. But sometimes when I check the local news online, I still see reports of missing teenagers in nearby towns. Always in groups of 7, always in the summer, always during a full moon. Some stories don't have proper endings. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. But I know one thing for certain: I'll never swim in Red Creek again. And if you're ever driving through Arkansas and see a sign for a swimming hole with crystal clear water and old oak trees, keep driving. Some waters run deeper than they appear, and some secrets should stay beneath the surface. Just when you thought it was safe to relax, the next story will prove you wrong. The old Kent County flour mill loomed over our small Kansas town like a watchful giant. Growing up, we all knew the stories about the missing kids and the bloodstains that wouldn't wash away. But none of us really believed them. That changed for me last summer, during my final year of high school. I was working the late shift at Murphy's gas station, trying to save up for college. The night shift was usually dead quiet, perfect for catching up on homework between the occasional customer stopping for gas or cigarettes. That particular night in July was sticky hot, even with the ancient AC unit struggling to keep up. Around midnight, a group of kids from my school came rushing in, their faces flushed with excitement. I recognized Tommy Peterson, a sophomore known for getting into trouble, and his usual gang of misfits. "Hey, Mark," Tommy called out, leaning against the counter. "Want to join us after your shift? We're heading to the old mill." I shook my head. "You know that place is off limits. Sheriff Coleman's been cracking down on trespassers." "That's what makes it fun," Sarah, Tommy's girlfriend, chimed in. "Besides, we found something interesting. The door to the basement level was open tonight." My stomach tightened at those words. The basement level had been sealed off since the 80s, after 3 kids went missing down there. Their bodies were never found, but rumors spread about bloody handprints on the walls and the sound of grinding machinery echoing through the empty building. "You guys are crazy," I said, but something in their excited faces made me curious. I'd driven past that mill hundreds of times, wondering what secrets it held. Tommy pulled out his phone and showed me a video. The footage was shaky, but I could make out the massive grinding stones in the basement, covered in decades of dust. Something dark stained the stone floor. "We're going back tonight," he said. "There's this game the original Miller's kids used to play." Sarah found it in her grandmother's diary. "Each floor requires a different offering, and if you make it to the top floor, you get whatever you wish for." I should have said no. I should have called Sheriff Coleman right then. Instead, I heard myself saying, "My shift ends at 2 a.m. The mill looked different at night. Moonlight filtered through broken windows, casting strange shadows across the weed-choked parking lot. 6 of us gathered there: Tommy, Sarah, me, and 3 others I barely knew from school. "Here are the rules," Sarah whispered, pulling out a worn leather diary. "Each floor requires a blood offering. Just a few drops. The higher you go, the more you need to give. Make it to the top floor, and the Miller's family will grant your deepest wish." "This is stupid," I muttered, but I followed them inside anyway. The first floor was easy. We each pricked our fingers with safety pins, letting drops of blood fall onto the dusty floor. Nothing happened at first, but then we heard it, the slow groan of machinery coming to life somewhere below us. "It's probably just the wind," I said, but my voice shook. The second floor required more blood. Tommy used his pocket knife to make shallow cuts on our palms. As our blood dripped onto the floorboards, the grinding sounds grew louder. That's when we noticed the flour, fresh white powder, falling from the ceiling like snow. Sarah started crying on the 3rd floor. The diary said we needed to fill a small cup with blood. "This is too much," she said, backing away. "We should go." But Tommy was already cutting deeper into his arm, his eyes glazed with a strange excitement. The cup slowly filled as each of us contributed. When the last drop fell, the whole building shuddered. That's when we heard the singing. It came from above us, children's voices singing an old hymn. The words were unclear, but the melody raised goosebumps on my arms. The grinding sounds had become deafening. "One more floor," Tommy shouted over the noise. "We're so close." But Sarah screamed. Fresh flour was pouring from the ceiling vents, but it wasn't white anymore. It was red. We ran for the stairs, but they were gone. In their place was a smooth wall of grinding stones, turning faster and faster. The children's voices grew louder, and through the red haze I saw them, small figures in old-fashioned clothes, their faces covered in flour, reaching for us with bloody hands. Tommy went first. He just walked toward them, smiling, as if in a trance. The grinding stones opened like a mouth, and he stepped in. Sarah screamed his name, but the sound was lost in the mechanical roar. I don't remember how I got out. I woke up in the parking lot as dawn broke, covered in flour and blood that wasn't mine. Sarah and the others were gone. The mill stood silent, its windows dark and empty. Sheriff Coleman led the search for 2 weeks. They found nothing. No bodies, no blood, no signs of struggle. Just fresh flour in all the machines, despite the mill having no power for 40 years. I drive past the mill every day on my way to community college. Sometimes, late at night, I see lights in the windows and hear the distant sound of grinding stones. And on quiet nights, when the wind blows just right, I can still hear children singing. The official report says 5 teenagers ran away that summer, but I know the truth. They're still there, in the mill, playing that endless game. And sometimes, when I look at the flour in my mother's kitchen, I can't help but wonder what it's really made of. I never told anyone the full story until now. But last week, I saw Tommy's little brother heading toward the mill with a group of friends, carrying safety pins and a small knife. I wanted to stop them, to warn them, but I couldn't make myself go near that building. The grinding never stops, and the miller's family is always looking for more players. Think you've heard the worst of it? Let's see if you can handle what's next. The summer job posting for Blackwood Trail State Park seemed perfect. Fresh out of college with my forestry degree, I was eager to put my training to use as a junior ranger. The pay wasn't great, but the location was beautiful: dense Oregon forest, pristine hiking trails, and a chance to work outdoors. If only I'd known what was waiting in those woods. My first few weeks were routine, maintaining trails, helping lost hikers, and documenting local wildlife. That changed when Senior Ranger Mike Thompson asked me to help investigate some disturbing animal deaths. We'd found several deer carcasses that looked wrong. The injuries weren't consistent with local predators, and parts seemed deliberately removed. Could be bears, Mike suggested, but his voice carried doubt. I'd seen bear kills before this was different. The cuts were too precise, almost surgical. We documented everything and sent reports to the wildlife department, but something about those mutilated animals kept nagging at me. Then the missing persons reports started coming in. At first they seemed unrelated. A solo hiker here, a camping couple there. But when I started mapping the disappearances, a pattern emerged. They all happened near the northern section of Blackwood Trail, and oddly enough, always every third night. I shared my findings with Mike. He took one look at my maps and went pale. "There's an old cave system up there," he said quietly. "It was supposedly sealed off decades ago after some accidents. But lately I've been hearing things during night patrols, sounds that shouldn't be there." We decided to investigate the caves, though Mike insisted we wait for backup from the state police. But that night, during my regular patrol, I noticed fresh boot prints leading toward the restricted area. Against my better judgment, I followed them. The sun was setting as I reached the cave entrance. The danger, "Do not enter," sign hung crooked, its chain broken. My flashlight beam revealed that the old barrier had been partially cleared away. A cool draft carried a smell that made my stomach turn, a mix of decay and something else, something cooking. I should have turned back. I should have waited for Mike and the police. Instead, I clicked on my radio's emergency beacon and ventured inside. The beam of my flashlight showed that the narrow passage sloped downward, and I could see more recent footprints in the dust. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber, and that's when I heard it, voices echoing from deeper within. Not panicked voices of trapped hikers, but casual conversation punctuated by laughter. The sound was so incongruous it made my skin crawl. Following the voices led me to a crack in the wall that opened into another chamber. Light flickered from below, not electric light, but the orange glow of fire. I edged closer and peered down. What I saw still haunts my nightmares. A family, if you could call them that, had made the caves their home. 3 generations living in a makeshift underground village. But it was their dinner that made me bite back a scream. Hanging from the cave ceiling were parts, human parts. They had hooks set up like a butcher's shop. I must have made some sound because suddenly all activity below ceased. A voice, young, female, cheerful, called out, "Daddy, I think dinner just walked in." The whole family looked up, their pale faces catching the firelight, showing teeth filed to points. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life, their whooping calls echoing behind me. Somehow I made it out of the cave just as Mike and the state police arrived, responding to my emergency beacon. The investigation that followed revealed the full horror. 57 people had disappeared over 2 decades. The cave system was extensive, with chambers full of belongings taken from victims. The family had been living there for generations, hunting on a strict schedule to avoid detection. Most of the rangers quit after that. I stayed on, though I still can't explain why. Maybe because someone needs to watch this place, to remember. The caves were properly sealed with concrete now, but sometimes, on quiet nights, I swear I can still hear laughter echoing from deep in the ground. The official report says they caught all members of the family. But I know what I saw down there. There were more chambers, more tunnels. And sometimes when I check the wildlife cameras, I catch glimpses of movement in the dark. Small figures, moving with inhuman grace, always on every 3rd night. I've never hiked Blackwood Trail again. These days, I stick to the ranger station, watching the security feeds, watching for patterns. Because deep down, I know the truth. We didn't find all of them. And somewhere in those caves, they're still waiting, still hungry, still keeping to their schedule. The darkness in the last story was just a shadow of what's about to come. The warm Mississippi evening air felt thick and sticky against my skin as I pulled into the dusty parking lot of the Pine County Fair. The familiar scent of cotton candy and fried dough drifted through my open car window, bringing back memories of childhood summers spent here with my family. Now, as the local newspaper's junior reporter, I was covering the fair's grand reopening after its mysterious 5-year closure. The Ferris wheel's multicolored lights blinked lazily against the darkening sky, casting strange shadows across the nearly empty lot. It was only Wednesday, and the weekend crowd hadn't arrived yet. Perfect timing for my story, I thought, grabbing my notebook and phone. The ticket booth was staffed by an elderly woman with deep-set eyes and weathered skin. Her name tag read Margaret. As she handed me my entrance ticket, her cold fingers brushed against mine, and she held on just a moment too long. "Be careful in there, dear," she whispered, her voice crackling like dead leaves. "Some things aren't what they seem." I laughed nervously and pulled my hand away, chalking it up to small-town eccentricity. But her words left an odd feeling in my stomach. The fairground seemed normal enough at first. Children ran between game booths while their parents tried their luck at ring toss and balloon darts. The smell of hamburgers and hot dogs drifted from food trucks, mixing with the sugary scent of funnel cakes. My first interview was with Jake Miller, who ran the Ferris wheel. He was new to town, like most of the carnival workers. As we talked about safety regulations and maintenance schedules, I noticed something odd. Every few minutes, he would check his watch and scan the crowd, as if looking for someone. "Mind if I take a ride?" I asked, hoping to get some photos from the top. Jake's face twitched. "Sorry, ma'am, technical difficulties. Maybe later." But I could see the wheel turning, carrying passengers up into the twilight sky. Before I could question him further, he was called away by another worker. Walking through the carnival, I started noticing other strange things. The workers all had the same vacant look in their eyes. They moved with an odd synchronization, like dancers in a choreographed performance. And there were these moments, brief pauses where everything seemed to stop, like a skipped frame in a video. Near the Hall of Mirrors, I spotted a fortune teller's tent I didn't remember from previous years. The sign read Madame Rosa, sees all, knows all, in faded gold letters. Something drew me inside. The tent was darker than it should have been, considering the early evening light outside. Madame Rosa sat behind a small table, her face hidden beneath a black veil. Without speaking, she motioned for me to sit. Her cards fell on the table with soft whispers. Suddenly, she grabbed my wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. 43, she hissed. 43 in 7 days. The wheel turns, and they disappear. You've seen them watching. You've noticed their eyes. I tried to pull away, but she wouldn't let go. The harvest must continue. It's hungry, so hungry. Look behind the red trailer after midnight, but don't let them see you looking. Just then, carousel music started playing outside, startlingly loud. When I turned back, Madame Rosa was gone. The tent seemed larger, emptier, and the air had turned cold. That's when I started counting. Really counting. How many children got on the Ferris wheel, and how many got off? How many people entered the Hall of Mirrors, and how many emerged? The numbers didn't add up. I waited until midnight, hidden behind a popcorn stand. The crowd had thinned to almost nothing. The remaining carnival workers moved with purpose now, their earlier vacancy replaced with mechanical precision. They gathered near a large red trailer behind the Ferris wheel. Using my phone's camera, I zoomed in on the scene. The workers were carrying large, heavy bags. Dark liquid dripped onto the dirt. The smell, how had I not noticed that smell before? Like copper and meat and something else I couldn't identify. A hand fell on my shoulder. "Curious little reporter," Jake's voice said behind me. "Always asking questions, always counting." I ran. Past the silent rides, through the empty game booths, my feet kicking up dust. Behind me, I heard many footsteps, moving in perfect synchronization. The Ferris wheel turned faster now, its lights burning brighter, casting wild shadows that seemed to reach for me. I made it to my car, shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I sped away, I looked in my rearview mirror. The carnival workers stood in a perfect line at the entrance, watching me leave. Above them, the Ferris wheel spun at an impossible speed, its lights pulsing like a heartbeat. That was 3 days ago. I've written this all down because people need to know. The fair is still open, still drawing crowds. Children are still disappearing. I've counted 41 so far. When I try to tell people, they just smile and say I'm imagining things. Even my editor wouldn't listen. This morning I found a fortune teller's card on my doorstep. The tower, spattered with something dark. And tonight I can hear carousel music playing, even though I'm miles from the fairground. 2 more to go until 43. I've started seeing the carnival lights from my window at night, getting closer each time. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can feel the Ferris wheel turning, turning, turning. Brace yourself. The next story will leave you questioning every sound you hear tonight. The job posting seemed perfect. Temporary lighthouse keeper at Lighthouse Point, Maine, while the regular keeper recovered from surgery. 6 months of solitude, decent pay, and a chance to work on my writing. I should have wondered why they were so desperate to fill the position. My first week was exactly what I expected. The lighthouse itself was beautiful, a white tower rising nearly 100 feet above the rocky coast. The keeper's cottage was small but cozy, with weathered shingles and blue shutters. The locals in town were polite but distant, though I noticed how they stared when they thought I wasn't looking. The trouble started during my second week. I was updating the logbook when I found some odd entries from previous keepers, references to offerings and appeasement, mentions of those below, and keeping the peace. I assumed it was just local folklore until the first disappearance. A young couple had been hiking along the cliffs. The townspeople seemed unusually interested in them, especially when they mentioned staying a few days. That night, I heard screaming from the rocks below the lighthouse. By the time I grabbed my flashlight and ran down, there was nothing, just the waves crashing against the shore. The police came, but the locals barely seemed concerned. "Probably fell in," they said. "Happens sometimes." But their eyes told a different story. I started paying more attention to the tides after that. During the lowest tides of the month, I could see strange shapes beneath the water, geometric forms that shouldn't exist naturally. Once, I swore I saw spires and towers rising from the seafloor, but when I looked again, they were gone. The logbooks became my obsession. Reading backwards through decades of entries, I found a pattern. Every month, like clockwork, visitors would disappear. Always on the night of the lowest tide. Always near the lighthouse. 67 souls claimed by the sea, according to my count. Last night was the lowest tide of the month. I was updating the log when I heard footsteps on the cottage porch. The townspeople were there, dozens of them, standing silently in the dark. Their eyes reflected the lighthouse beam as it swept past. Behind them, I heard splashing, something massive moving in the water. "It's time for the offering," the mayor said. "We hoped you'd work out, but you've been asking too many questions. I managed to barricade myself in the lighthouse tower. They're still out there now, waiting. I can hear something climbing the rocks, something big. The tower feels less secure with each passing hour. The tide is rising. I'm writing this quickly, hoping someone finds it. If you're reading this, stay away from Lighthouse Point. Don't trust the friendly job postings or the quaint town. Whatever lives beneath these waters, it's hungry. And the locals? They're just its faithful servants, feeding it a steady diet of outsiders. The scratching at the door is getting louder. The hinges won't hold much longer. The tide is almost full now, and I can hear singing from the rocks below, not from the townspeople but from something else, something ancient. I have to stop writing. They're breaking through. But remember, if you're ever offered a job at Lighthouse Point, run as far as you can. Because once the tide rises and those shapes appear beneath the waves, it's already too late. What you've heard so far is child's play compared to the horrors waiting in the next tale. My grandmother always said there was power in tradition. Growing up in rural Pennsylvania, I watched her dedicate countless hours to her quilting circle, a group of elderly women who'd been meeting every Wednesday for as long as anyone could remember. I never paid much attention to their craft until I inherited Grandma Rose's house last winter. The first few weeks after moving in were peaceful. I spent my time sorting through decades of memories, finding old photos, letters, and her precious quilts. Each one was a masterpiece of intricate patterns, though something about their deep red threading always struck me as odd. It started with a knock at my door one Wednesday afternoon. Mrs. Henderson, one of the last remaining members of Grandma's quilting circle, stood on my porch with a gentle smile. "Your grandmother would have wanted you to join us," she said, holding up an ornate wooden sewing box. "We meet in the basement, just like always." I hadn't even known my grandmother's house had a basement. That evening, I found the door hidden behind an old wardrobe in the spare room. The stairs creaked under my feet as I descended, flashlight beam dancing across stone walls that seemed impossibly old. The basement was larger than the house above it, with curved archways leading to chambers I couldn't quite see. 5 women sat in a circle, working on what looked like the largest quilt I'd ever seen. Their needles moved in perfect unison, silver glinting in the candlelight. They welcomed me warmly, showing me where to sit in what had been my grandmother's chair. "We've been waiting for you," Mrs. Henderson said, passing me a needle. "Every quilt needs new blood to bind the pattern." I pricked my finger accidentally, or so I thought, and watched in horror as my blood soaked into the fabric, spreading through the threads like living veins. The pattern began to shift before my eyes, forming shapes that seemed to writhe and pulse. That's when I noticed the faces in the quilt, dozens of them trapped in the fabric, mouths frozen in silent screams. And in the corner, unmistakable, the features of Mr. Collins, who'd gone missing last spring. I ran upstairs, but the door had vanished. Behind me, their footsteps echoed on the stone, accompanied by the soft swish of fabric. "Your grandmother was our best seamstress," Mrs. Henderson called out. "She could bind a soul to cloth with just 3 stitches. The beam of my flashlight caught something that made my blood run cold. Shelves lined with preserved bodies, each one wrapped in quilts that seemed to breathe. The dates on the nearby ledger went back to colonial times, each entry marked with a small square of fabric. I found another staircase, hidden behind a rotting tapestry. It led up into darkness, and I took my chance. As I climbed, I heard their voices below, chanting something in a language that made my ears hurt. The stairs seemed endless, spiraling up until I finally burst through another hidden door, into my neighbor's cellar. That was 3 months ago. I've moved across the country since then, but I can't escape it. Every town I visit, I see their quilts hanging in shop windows and craft fairs. Beautiful patterns that seem to shift when you look too long, threads that shine like fresh blood in the light. Sometimes I wake up to find scraps of fabric on my pillow, bits of thread caught in my hair. And in my dreams I hear the rhythmic clicking of needles, drawing souls tight into ancient patterns, binding them forever in cloth and blood. The worst part? I've started noticing my fingers moving on their own, tracing patterns in the air. And yesterday, I found myself buying a sewing kit, my hands shaking as I picked up the needles. They felt familiar, like old friends waiting to share their secrets. I know they're coming for me. The quilting circle never leaves a pattern unfinished. And somewhere in that basement there's an empty chair waiting, next to a quilt that needs just one more piece to be complete. If you thought you'd sleep after this, the next story might keep you awake for days. It was just another Wednesday afternoon when I moved into 42 Maple Street in Springfield, Missouri. Dark liquid dripped onto the dirt. The smell, how had I not noticed that smell before? Like copper and meat and something else I couldn't identify. A hand fell on my shoulder. "Curious little reporter," Jake's voice said behind me. "Always asking questions, always counting." I ran. Past the silent rides, through the empty game booths, my feet kicking up dust. Behind me, I heard many footsteps, moving in perfect synchronization. The Ferris wheel turned faster now, its lights burning brighter, casting wild shadows that seemed to reach for me. I made it to my car, shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I sped away, I looked in my rearview mirror. The carnival workers stood in a perfect line at the entrance, watching me leave. Above them, the Ferris wheel spun at an impossible speed, its lights pulsing like a heartbeat. That was 3 days ago. I've written this all down because people need to know. The fair is still open, still drawing crowds. Children are still disappearing. I've counted 41 so far. When I try to tell people, they just smile and say I'm imagining things. Even my editor wouldn't listen. This morning I found a fortune teller's card on my doorstep. The tower, spattered with something dark. And tonight I can hear carousel music playing, even though I'm miles from the fairground. 2 more to go until 43. I've started seeing the carnival lights from my window at night, getting closer each time. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can feel the Ferris wheel turning, turning, turning. Brace yourself. The next story will leave you questioning every sound you hear tonight. The job posting seemed perfect. Temporary lighthouse keeper at Lighthouse Point, Maine, while the regular keeper recovered from surgery. 6 months of solitude, decent pay, and a chance to work on my writing. I should have wondered why they were so desperate to fill the position. My first week was exactly what I expected. The lighthouse itself was beautiful, a white tower rising nearly 100 feet above the rocky coast. The keeper's cottage was small but cozy, with weathered shingles and blue shutters. The locals in town were polite but distant, though I noticed how they stared when they thought I wasn't looking. The trouble started during my second week. I was updating the logbook when I found some odd entries from previous keepers. References to offerings and appeasement, mentions of those below, and keeping the peace. I assumed it was just local folklore until the first disappearance. A young couple had been hiking along the cliffs. The townspeople seemed unusually interested in them, especially when they mentioned staying a few days. That night, I heard screaming from the rocks below the lighthouse. By the time I grabbed my flashlight and ran down, there was nothing, just the waves crashing against the shore. The police came, but the locals barely seemed concerned. "Probably fell in," they said. "Happens sometimes." But their eyes told a different story. I started paying more attention to the tides after that. During the lowest tides of the month, I could see strange shapes beneath the water, geometric forms that shouldn't exist naturally. Once, I swore I saw spires and towers rising from the seafloor, but when I looked again, they were gone. The logbooks became my obsession. Reading backwards through decades of entries, I found a pattern. Every month, like clockwork, visitors would disappear. Always on the night of the lowest tide. Always near the lighthouse. 67 souls claimed by the sea, according to my count. Last night was the lowest tide of the month. I was updating the log when I heard footsteps on the cottage porch. The townspeople were there, dozens of them, standing silently in the dark. Their eyes reflected the lighthouse beam as it swept past. Behind them, I heard splashing, something massive moving in the water. "It's time for the offering," the mayor said. "We hoped you'd work out, but you've been asking too many questions." I managed to barricade myself in the lighthouse tower. They're still out there now, waiting. I can hear something climbing the rocks, something big, The tower feels less secure with each passing hour. The tide is rising. I'm writing this quickly, hoping someone finds it. If you're reading this, stay away from Lighthouse Point. Don't trust the friendly job postings or the quaint town. Whatever lives beneath these waters, it's hungry. And the locals? They're just its faithful servants, feeding it a steady diet of outsiders. The scratching at the door is getting louder. The hinges won't hold much longer. The tide is almost full now, and I can hear singing from the rocks below, not from the townspeople, but from something else, something ancient. I have to stop writing. They're breaking through. But remember, if you're ever offered a job at Lighthouse Point, run as far as you can. Because once the tide rises and those shapes appear beneath the waves, it's already too late. What you've heard so far is child's play compared to the horrors waiting in the next tale. My grandmother always said there was power in tradition. Growing up in rural Pennsylvania, I watched her dedicate countless hours to her quilting circle, a group of elderly women who'd been meeting every Wednesday for as long as anyone could remember. I never paid much attention to their craft until I inherited Grandma Rose's house last winter. The first few weeks after moving in were peaceful. I spent my time sorting through decades of memories, finding old photos, letters, and her precious quilts. Each one was a masterpiece of intricate patterns, though something about their deep red threading always struck me as odd. It started with a knock at my door one Wednesday afternoon. Mrs. Henderson, one of the last remaining members of Grandma's quilting circle, stood on my porch with a gentle smile. "Your grandmother would have wanted you to join us," she said, holding up an ornate wooden sewing box. "We meet in the basement, just like always." I hadn't even known my grandmother's house had a basement. That evening, I found the door hidden behind an old wardrobe in the spare room. The stairs creaked under my feet as I descended, flashlight beam dancing across stone walls that seemed impossibly old. The basement was larger than the house above it, with curved archways leading to chambers I couldn't quite see. 5 women sat in a circle, working on what looked like the largest quilt I'd ever seen. Their needles moved in perfect unison, silver glinting in the candlelight. They welcomed me warmly, showing me where to sit in what had been my grandmother's chair. "We've been waiting for you," Mrs. Henderson said, passing me a needle. "Every quilt needs new blood to bind the pattern." I pricked my finger accidentally, or so I thought, and watched in horror as my blood soaked into the fabric, spreading through the threads like living veins. The pattern began to shift before my eyes, forming shapes that seemed to writhe and pulse. That's when I noticed the faces in the quilt, dozens of them trapped in the fabric, mouths frozen in silent screams. And in the corner, unmistakable, the features of Mr. Collins, who'd gone missing last spring. I ran upstairs, but the door had vanished. Behind me, their footsteps echoed on the stone, accompanied by the soft swish of fabric. "Your grandmother was our best seamstress," Mrs. Henderson called out. "She could bind a soul to cloth with just 3 stitches. The beam of my flashlight caught something that made my blood run cold. Shelves lined with preserved bodies, each one wrapped in quilts that seemed to breathe. The dates on the nearby ledger went back to colonial times, each entry marked with a small square of fabric. I found another staircase, hidden behind a rotting tapestry. It led up into darkness, and I took my chance. As I climbed, I heard their voices below, chanting something in a language that made my ears hurt. The stairs seemed endless, spiraling up until I finally burst through another hidden door, into my neighbor's cellar. That was 3 months ago. I've moved across the country since then, but I can't escape it. Every town I visit, I see their quilts hanging in shop windows and craft fairs. Beautiful patterns that seem to shift when you look too long, threads that shine like fresh blood in the light. Sometimes I wake up to find scraps of fabric on my pillow, bits of thread caught in my hair. And in my dreams I hear the rhythmic clicking of needles, drawing souls tight into ancient patterns, binding them forever in cloth and blood. The worst part? I've started noticing my fingers moving on their own, tracing patterns in the air. And yesterday, I found myself buying a sewing kit, my hands shaking as I picked up the needles. They felt familiar, like old friends waiting to share their secrets. I know they're coming for me, The quilting circle never leaves a pattern unfinished. And somewhere in that basement there's an empty chair waiting, next to a quilt that needs just one more piece to be complete. If you thought you'd sleep after this, the next story might keep you awake for days. It was just another Wednesday afternoon when I moved into 42 Maple Street in Springfield, Missouri. A traveling salesman whose car was found abandoned at a rest stop. A young woman who disappeared while jogging. Each time, within days, Mr. Peterson would be out in his garden at midnight, and a new white flag would appear in his yard. I started taking photos with my phone, documenting the disturbed soil sites, the barrels, the flags. I drew a map of his yard, marking each spot where the ground had been dug up. When I connected the dots, they formed a perfect spiral, with his prized rose garden at the center. The annual county garden competition was approaching, and Mr. Peterson was spending more time than ever in his greenhouse. The roses were magnificent this year, their red so deep it was almost black. The fragrance was overwhelming, sickly sweet, with an underlying metallic tang that reminded me of the time I'd cut myself pruning my own garden. One night, I saw lights in his greenhouse well past midnight. The chemical smell was stronger than ever. Making a decision that was either very brave or very foolish, I crept across my yard and along the fence until I reached the greenhouse. The glass was fogged, but I could see Mr. Peterson's silhouette moving inside. He appeared to be struggling with something large. I found a section of glass I could see through clearly and pressed my face close. What I saw inside made me gasp, loud enough that Mr. Peterson turned toward the sound. Our eyes met through the glass. His were calm, almost amused. He smiled and waved, just like he always did, even as the large garbage bag behind him moved and twisted on its own. I ran back to my house and locked every door and window. My hands trembled as I tried to dial 911. But then I heard it, the soft crunch of footsteps on my back porch. Mr. Peterson's voice drifted through the door, as pleasant as ever. "Martha, I saw you by the greenhouse. Why don't you come over? I'd love to show you how I make my roses grow so beautifully. I've been wanting to share my secret with someone who would really appreciate it." More footsteps, moving around to the side of the house. His voice came again, closer now. "You know, I've always admired your garden too. Such potential. The soil in your yard. It's perfect for roses. Deep, rich, hungry. I'm writing this now from my bedroom closet. The chemical smell is seeping under my door, making my head spin. My phone has no signal somehow. I'm sure he's responsible for that too. I can hear him moving through my house, calling my name. He's still using that friendly, neighborly voice. But there's something else beneath it now. Something that sounds like the rustle of roses in the wind, like soil settling over secrets. The worst part? I can smell his roses, their sweetness filling my house, and now I know why they bloom so red, so vibrant. I know why they win every competition. I know what feeds their roots. He's coming up the stairs now. Each step is slow, deliberate. He's still talking about his roses, about how beautiful they'll look planted along my fence, about how the soil needs preparation, about how some gardens require special fertilizer. If anyone finds this, stay away from the roses in Mr. Peterson's garden. Don't breathe in their sweet perfume. Don't admire their unnatural blooms. And whatever you do, don't look too closely at the freshly turned soil in the spiral pattern behind his house. Some things, once seen, can never be unseen. The doorknob is turning. Mr. Peterson is humming a gardening tune. And his roses are always so red. The last story was only a warm-up for the nightmare that lies ahead. Taking the night shift cleaning job at Riverside Memorial Hospital wasn't my first choice, but bills don't pay themselves. The aging hospital sat on the outskirts of town, its old brick walls holding decades of history. My first night, Mike, the day shift supervisor, gave me a quick tour, his keys jangling as we walked through the quiet halls. "Most of it's pretty straightforward," he said, pointing out the supply closets and break room. "Just stay out of the east wing, it's being renovated. Construction crews got it torn up pretty bad." He paused, then added, "And don't mind the noises. Old buildings talk, you know." The work was simple enough. Mop floors, empty trash, sanitized surfaces. The night crew was small, just me, a few other cleaners, and the occasional nurse making rounds. Most nights were quiet, just the hum of fluorescent lights and the squeak of my mop bucket wheels on the linoleum. It was during my third week when things started feeling off. I was cleaning near the east wing entrance when I heard humming coming from behind the renovation barriers. It sounded like an old lullaby, the kind my grandmother used to sing. But when I stopped to listen, it faded away. The next night, I found an old patient ID bracelet while emptying trash in the basement. The plastic was yellowed with age, dated 1962. The name was still clear. Margaret Chen, room E, 314. That was odd. All trash from the East Wing renovation was supposed to go in special dumpsters outside. I started finding more old things after that. A hairbrush with brittle bristles, a small diary with water-damaged pages, reading glasses with thick frames, all from the 1960s, all turning up in regular trash bins throughout the hospital. It didn't make sense. One night, while cleaning the records room, I overheard two orderlies talking in the hall. They didn't know I was there. Room 412, one said. Like the others. Dr. Stevens says it's time. Tonight? Yeah. Family never visits. No one will notice. Their footsteps faded away. I tried to tell myself they were talking about something normal, but their voices had been too quiet, too careful. A week later, I was mopping near the old laundry chute when I heard something moving inside the wall. Not mice. This was bigger, like something sliding down the chute. But according to Mike, the laundry chutes had been sealed up years ago when they built the new washing facility. I started paying more attention after that, noting which patients disappeared in the night, which rooms suddenly became empty. The official records always had explanations: transferred, discharged, deceased from natural causes. But I noticed patterns. The patients were always alone. No family, no friends, no one to ask questions. Then I found the notebook hidden behind a loose ceiling tile in the basement. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, dated 1964. It was a doctor's journal, Dr. James Stevens. He wrote about mercy and difficult cases and easing suffering. But between the lines was something darker: numbers, dates, names, and at the bottom of each page, case resolved. I started researching. Dr. Stevens had worked at Riverside for 30 years. He was remembered as a dedicated physician, always taking the hardest cases, always working late. The hospital had given him a special commendation when he retired in 1975. But I found other stories too. Whispers online about missing patients. Rumors of bodies found in the river miles downstream. All dismissed, all explained away. The stories stopped after Stevens died in 1980, or at least, I thought they had. Last night I was cleaning the morgue when the power went out. Emergency lights cast everything in dim red. I heard the elevator ding, then footsteps, multiple people, trying to be quiet. I hid behind a storage cabinet. Through the gap I saw 3 orderlies and a doctor I recognized, Dr. Walker, the night shift supervisor. They were wheeling a gurney with a body bag. Like the others, Walker said, his voice eerily similar to the one from Dr. Stevens' old recordings I'd found online. No family, no connections. Perfect candidate. They moved to the back wall and pressed something. A panel slid open, an old laundry chute, wider than the others. As they lifted the body bag, I saw the patient ID bracelet. Room 412. The power came back on suddenly. In the bright light I saw what was behind the panel, a vast network of old chutes and passages stretching up through the building, and on the walls more body bags, dozens of them, some recent, some decades old. I must have made a noise. They turned, saw me. I ran. Through the halls, upstairs, not daring to use the elevator. Behind me, footsteps, voices, keys jangling. I made it out somehow. Called the police from my car, but when they searched the hospital, they found nothing. The panel in the morgue was gone, the wall smooth concrete. No hidden passages, no body bags. Dr. Walker and the orderlies had alibis. Video footage showed them in other parts of the hospital all night. I quit the next day, filed reports, contacted newspapers. No one believed me. How could they? The evidence was gone, sealed up behind concrete and drywall just like in the 1960s. But I know what I saw. And I watch the hospital's death records. Every few weeks, another lonely patient dies quietly in the night. The cause is always natural, always explained. Just like in Dr. Stevens' time. Sometimes at night, I drive past Riverside Memorial. The East Wing renovation is complete now, the old brick cleaned and pointed. But if you look carefully at the walls, you can see where the laundry chutes used to be. And sometimes, late at night, lights move behind the windows of empty rooms. Yesterday, I got a letter. Inside was a job offer from Riverside Memorial. Night shift supervisor, excellent pay. The signature at the bottom looked just like the one in Dr. Stevens' old notebook. And in the corner, written in familiar neat handwriting, the work must continue. I burned the letter. But when I looked at the ashes, they spelled out 3 words. See you soon. The hospital is hiring again. New cleaning staff for the night shift. The ad says they're expanding the East Wing. More rooms, more patients. More lonely people that no one will miss. And every night, the old laundry chutes wait behind the walls, ready to hold more secrets. Ready for someone to continue Dr. Stevens' work. Because some traditions never die. They just get buried deeper, hidden behind fresh paint and new concrete, waiting for the next shift to begin. If the last tale gave you chills, the next one might just freeze your soul. The job listing for Camp Evergreen seemed perfect. Counselor at a remote mountain summer camp in upstate New York, decent pay, and a chance to spend 3 months surrounded by nature. After 5 years of working retail in the city, I was desperate for a change. When they offered me the position, I packed my bags without hesitation. I should have asked more questions. My first red flag came during orientation. The camp director, Mrs. Henderson, was going through emergency procedures when another counselor, Rita, asked about the buddy system for swimming. No one swims alone, Mrs. Henderson said firmly. Not campers, not counselors, not staff. No exceptions. There was something in her voice that made me pay attention. And no swimming after sunset. The lake isn't safe in the dark. I thought she was being overdramatic. The lake looked beautiful. Crystal clear water surrounded by towering pine trees. But during my first week, I started noticing things. Little things at first, like how none of the local staff would go near the lake after dark, or how the older kids would whisper about the shadow person they saw standing on the dock at night. I was in charge of the youngest group, 12 kids between ages 8 and 10. They were great kids, full of energy and excitement. But they also seemed to pick up on things that adults missed. Jenny, one of my most level-headed campers, was the first to mention it directly. We were doing arts and crafts when she tugged on my sleeve. "Mr. Brooks," she whispered, "the shadow person is watching us again." I looked where she was pointing, toward the lake visible through the craft cabin's windows. For a second, I thought I saw something dark move between the trees, but it was probably just branches swaying in the wind. "There's no shadow person, Jenny," I said with a smile. "It's just your imagination." She shook her head. "That's what they told Tommy, too, before he went away." "Tommy? He was here last summer. He went swimming at night and never came back." That conversation bothered me enough to start asking questions. Most of the staff brushed me off, but old Joe, the maintenance man who'd worked at the camp since the 1970s, finally gave me some answers. Every 10 years or so, he told me while fixing a broken window in the dining hall, we lose someone to the lake. Been happening since before my time. First one I know of was in 52, young counselor named David Parker. Then in 61, it was a camper. 72, another counselor. Pattern keeps going. I did the math in my head. The last incident would have been around 2012. What happened in 2012? Joe's hand stopped moving. That was a bad one. Counselor named James Wright lost his son here. Boy was only 7. After that, James changed. Started talking crazy about seeing things in the lake, claiming something was living in the water. They had to let him go. Did he leave the area? Nobody knows for sure. Some folks say they've seen him living rough in the woods. Others think he went back to the city. Me? Joe shrugged. I think he never left the lake. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about James Wright, about all those deaths spread out across decades. Using the camp's ancient computer, I started digging through old records. Most of the accident reports were pretty standard, drowning due to swimming alone or at night or during storms. But something felt off about them. Little details didn't match up. Witness statements contradicted official findings. And in every case, there were mentions of a dark figure seen near the lake before each incident. Then I found the photographs. They were old, yellowed with age, stuck between the pages of a 1952 incident report. They showed the lake being dragged after David Parker's disappearance. In one photo, something dark was visible in the water behind the search boat. The next photo showed the same scene, but the dark shape was closer to the surface. In the final photo, half hidden by water damage, there was what looked like a hand reaching up from the water, but the fingers were too long, the joints bent at impossible angles. I was still staring at those photos when I heard the singing. It was faint, coming from the direction of the lake, a child's voice, singing a camp song we'd taught the kids earlier that day. At midnight, when all the campers should have been in their cabins, grabbing my flashlight, I ran toward the sound. The moon was full, casting enough light to see the path, but deep shadows lurked between the trees. The singing got louder as I approached the lake. Then I saw her, Jenny, standing on the dock in her pajamas, staring out at the water. "Jenny," I called out. "Get back from there." She turned slowly. Her eyes were wide, unfocused. "The shadow person," she whispered. "He's showing me where they all are. Under the water. So many of them, Mr. Brooks. They're all sleeping down there." I reached for her just as something broke the surface of the lake. At first, I thought it was a log, something dark and long floating just beneath the surface. Then I saw eyes reflecting my flashlight beam. Dozens of them, opening all across its surface like pale flowers blooming in the dark. What happened next is still jumbled in my memory. I remember grabbing Jenny, remember running back toward the cabins. I remember the sound of something large dragging itself across the dock behind us, the wet slap of it hitting the shore. And I remember seeing a figure standing at the tree line, tall and thin, wearing what might have been an old counselor's uniform, its face hidden in shadow. It raised one hand as we passed, fingers too long and bent, at impossible angles, exactly like in the photograph. We made it back to the cabins. Jenny was fine, with no memory of going to the lake. I tried reporting what happened, but Mrs. Henderson just nodded like she'd heard it all before. 2 days later, they found the old boathouse had been lived in recently. There were newspaper clippings about the drownings pinned to the walls, photos of children, and a worn camp counselor badge belonging to James Wright. But they never found James, just like they never found David Parker or any of the others who vanished into those dark waters over the years. I quit the next day. Couldn't bring myself to stay, knowing what was in that lake, knowing that every 10 years it gets hungry again. I keep tabs on Camp Evergreen from a distance, keep track of the years. It's been almost 10 years since I left. Last week, I saw a job listing online. Camp Evergreen is looking for a new counselor for the upcoming summer season. The listing mentions they've just finished renovating the lake facilities. Swimming lessons will be a key part of this year's program. I think about those eyes under the water, about James Wright's twisted hand reaching out from the shadows, about all those bodies, perfectly preserved in the cold, deep parts of the lake where the sun never reaches. And I wonder, should I warn the person who takes that job? Would they even believe me? Sometimes late at night, I still hear that singing, camp songs floating on the wind, calling people to the water's edge. And in my dreams, I see Jenny standing on that dock, pointing down into the dark water, showing me where they all sleep, waiting for the next time the shadow person rises from the depths to feed. The official record shows that Camp Evergreen has had its share of tragic accidents over the years, just like any camp that's been around since the 1950s. But records can be changed, photos can be hidden, stories can be forgotten. Just remember, if you ever find yourself near a mountain lake on a summer night, and you hear children singing when there should only be silence. Don't look back. Don't go near the water. And whatever you do, don't trust the shadows that walk like men, calling you down to see what lies beneath the surface, in the cold, dark places where the missing go to sleep. Hold on to your courage, because the next story takes fear to a whole new level. Working as a mail carrier in the small town of Pine Grove wasn't exactly exciting, but it paid the bills. My route covered the outskirts of town, mostly farmhouses and rural properties spread far apart along winding country roads. After 3 years on the job, I knew every mailbox, every house, and most importantly, every resident on my route. That's why I started noticing when things didn't add up. It began with the Hendersons' place on Old Mill Road. Before I met Danny Price, Danny was a quiet kid, on the shy side but very bright. His mom had mentioned he loved to draw and paint at home. So when I first saw his work in class, it took me by surprise. Most of his drawings had an unsettling undertone. While the other students drew cheerful scenes with blue skies and green grass, Danny's landscapes were always gray and ominous. Skeletal trees, abandoned houses, dark shadowy figures looming in the background. I tried not to read too much into it at first. Plenty of kids go through a spooky phase, fascinated by anything creepy or morbid. But as the weeks went on, the disturbing elements in Danny's art became harder to ignore. He started drawing the interiors of the house's dusty, cobwebbed rooms with strange objects scattered about. Jars of liquid with unidentifiable floating shapes, rusty tools and contraptions hanging on the walls, and in many of the pictures, a door was cracked open leading to a hidden basement room. When I asked Danny about it, he just shrugged and said, "That's where the secret stuff happens." Then he went quiet and refused to elaborate further. His behavior began to change too. He seemed anxious, distracted, sometimes on the verge of revealing something but then thinking better of it. I wondered if everything was all right at home. At the fall parent-teacher conference, I brought up my concerns with Danny's parents. I didn't want to overstep, but I felt they should be aware of the dark themes consistently showing up in his artwork. To my surprise, they seemed completely unfazed. "Danny just has an active imagination," his father Gary said with a chuckle. "I'm a taxidermist, so he's seen me working on some unusual projects. It must have made an impression." The way he grinned when he said unusual projects made my skin crawl. I glanced at Danny's mother Karen to see her reaction, but she just smiled tightly and changed the subject. Something wasn't right, but I couldn't put my finger on what. After that, I kept a closer eye on Danny, both his drawings and his demeanor. He grew more withdrawn, almost secretive, and his art took an even darker turn. The hidden room in the basement started to appear more frequently. Inside were tables, restraints, and figures wrapped in plastic sheeting. I swear one looked like a small body. At this point, I was truly alarmed. What was going on in that house? I tried following up with his parents, but they brushed me off. Claimed Danny watched too many scary movies when they weren't paying attention, but I knew it had to be more than that. You don't just dream up rooms full of body-sized bundles and jars of human specimens. This was beyond the pale, even for the most morbid 8-year-old mind. I started losing sleep, questioning myself for not taking action sooner. I called in an anonymous tip to Child Protective Services but never heard anything back. Every day my gut told me Danny could be in serious danger, that his drawings weren't just fiction but reflections of a horrific reality. Then, one afternoon, Danny didn't show up to class. His seat remained empty the entire next week. My worst fears swirled in my head. What if something terrible had happened to him? What if he was locked away in that house of horrors, unable to escape? I finally worked up the courage to drive by the Price home after school. Their car was in the driveway, but all the lights were off inside. I parked across the street, trying to decide on my next move. That's when I heard the screams from within the house, agonizing wails muffled behind the closed front door. I called 911 in a panic before rushing to pound on the door myself. Mr. Price answered, his face scratched and bleeding, but he was smiling. "Danny is just playing with his friends," he said calmly. "No need to worry." I heard more screams and the sound of power tools revving from the open basement door behind him. Adrenaline shot through my veins. I shouldered past Mr. Price and sprinted down the stairs 2 at a time. The stench of chemicals and rotting meat slammed into me at the bottom. I stumbled to a stop, my mind reeling to process the horrific scene in front of me. Photographs covered one wall, showing dozens of victims in their final tortured moments. A workshop table on the other side displayed unfinished projects in various states of dissection and reassembly. And in the center were 2 small bodies strapped to tables, their lifeless eyes fixed on the ceiling. One of them was Danny. Behind me, a camera flashed as Karen captured my expression of abject shock and revulsion. Through my fog of horror, I realized this wasn't a killing room, it was an artist's studio, and I had just wandered in on their private exhibition. Gary stepped in front of the only exit, still smiling serenely. "You're just in time for the preview," he said, madness dancing in his eyes. "Welcome to our gallery showing." The taxidermy tools gleamed in his hands. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound escaped. Then everything went black. I must have lost consciousness from the shock and fumes, because the next thing I remember is waking up restrained to one of the tables, the blinding work light glaring down on me. Gary and Karen stood on either side, arranging their tools with delicate precision, as if preparing to make the first brushstroke on a pristine canvas. An artist's greatest work often goes unappreciated in their time, Gary mused, lovingly polishing a long, curved blade. "Luckily, we have a captive audience for our finest exhibition yet." He turned to me and winked. "It's a private showing, invitation only. And you, my dear, have a front row seat." Karen brought the camera up to her eye, framing me in the shot. "Smile for your close-up," she purred. "You're about to be immortalized as our magnum opus." The whir of the drill and my muffled screams faded under the clicks of the shutter as she documented my last moments. I'll never know what masterpiece of twisted flesh and bone they sculpted from my remains, because no one else has seen the Price's secret gallery and lived to tell the tale. Maybe one day their artwork will be discovered and gain the notoriety they craved. But for now, it remains hidden, waiting to lure in the next unwitting art lover foolish enough to stumble upon their exhibition of exquisite horrors. Take it from Maison galleries are better left unvisited. For once you see what lies behind the pristine facade, you can never unsee it. Their final work is on display in that basement as we speak. A pièce de résistance too terrible to imagine. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I swear I can still hear the whir of the drill and the click of the shutter, capturing beautifully depraved moments for all eternity in a private showing none of us were ever meant to see. What's scarier than the last story? This next one might just be the answer. The bell above the door chimed as the last customer of the night left the corner store. I sighed and rubbed my eyes, exhausted from another long shift. Glancing at my watch, I saw it was nearly 11 p.m. Time to close up shop. I went through my usual routine, counting the cash in the register, turning off the lights in the aisles, double-checking that the entrance was locked. The store felt eerie at night when it was empty and quiet. I always had the unshakable feeling that I wasn't alone, even though I knew I was the only one here. Well, the only living person, at least. This old building surely had its share of ghosts. The place had a dark history that I tried not to dwell on, but it crept into my thoughts more and more lately, especially after I found those stains in the stockroom last week. Rust-colored smears and spatters on the concrete floor, like a Jackson Pollock painting done in dried blood. I tried to tell myself it was just old motor oil or spilled paint, but I knew better. Something terrible had happened back there, maybe many terrible things over many years. I bought this little shop 8 months ago from the previous owner, an elderly man named Joe Kaufman who was eager to sell. Rumor was that old Joe left town abruptly after the sale went through. Packed a bag, hopped a bus, and hadn't been seen since. No forwarding address, no contact info. Like he wanted to disappear without a trace. People said he looked haunted near the end, always glancing over his shoulder, jumping at sudden noises. I figured he'd just grown tired of the daily grind and retired somewhere warm. Now I wasn't so sure. There was something cursed about this place. I sensed it more each day. At first, I shrugged off the unnerving feeling as my imagination. Too many late nights watching slasher flicks and reading creepypasta online. An overactive sense of impending doom, drummed into me by society's steady diet of grim headlines and sensationalized tragedy. This was the real world, after all. What was the worst that could happen here? But then the weird shit started. Little things at first. Items on shelves moved overnight. Muffled sounds from the walls. Fleeting shadows in mirrors. I told myself the building was just settling, that my mind was playing tricks. But the incidents kept piling up. Several times over the past month, I've gotten calls from the security company in the dead of night, alerted by the motion detectors. But each time I rushed over here, the store was still and silent. Nothing on the security cameras. No signs of entry. Before I met Danny Price, Danny was a quiet kid, on the shy side but very bright. His mom had mentioned he loved to draw and paint at home. So when I first saw his work in class, it took me by surprise. Most of his drawings had an unsettling undertone. While the other students drew cheerful scenes with blue skies and green grass, Danny's landscapes were always gray and ominous. Skeletal trees, abandoned houses, dark shadowy figures looming in the background. I tried not to read too much into it at first. Plenty of kids go through a spooky phase, fascinated by anything creepy or morbid. But as the weeks went on, the disturbing elements in Danny's art became harder to ignore. He started drawing the interiors of the house's dusty, cobwebbed rooms with strange objects scattered about. Jars of liquid with unidentifiable floating shapes, rusty tools and contraptions hanging on the walls, and in many of the pictures, a door was cracked open leading to a hidden basement room. When I asked Danny about it, he just shrugged and said, "That's where the secret stuff happens." Then he went quiet and refused to elaborate further. His behavior began to change too. He seemed anxious, distracted, sometimes on the verge of revealing something but then thinking better of it. I wondered if everything was all right at home. At the fall parent-teacher conference, I brought up my concerns with Danny's parents. I didn't want to overstep, but I felt they should be aware of the dark themes consistently showing up in his artwork. To my surprise, they seemed completely unfazed. "Danny just has an active imagination," his father Gary said with a chuckle. "I'm a taxidermist, so he's seen me working on some unusual projects. It must have made an impression." The way he grinned when he said unusual projects made my skin crawl. I glanced at Danny's mother Karen to see her reaction, but she just smiled tightly and changed the subject. Something wasn't right, but I couldn't put my finger on what. After that, I kept a closer eye on Danny, both his drawings and his demeanor. He grew more withdrawn, almost secretive, and his art took an even darker turn. The hidden room in the basement started to appear more frequently. Inside were tables, restraints, and figures wrapped in plastic sheeting. I swear one looked like a small body. At this point, I was truly alarmed. What was going on in that house? I tried following up with his parents, but they brushed me off. Claimed Danny watched too many scary movies when they weren't paying attention, but I knew it had to be more than that. You don't just dream up rooms full of body-sized bundles and jars of human specimens. This was beyond the pale, even for the most morbid 8-year-old mind. I started losing sleep, questioning myself for not taking action sooner. I called in an anonymous tip to Child Protective Services but never heard anything back. Every day my gut told me Danny could be in serious danger, that his drawings weren't just fiction but reflections of a horrific reality. Then, one afternoon, Danny didn't show up to class. His seat remained empty the entire next week. My worst fears swirled in my head. What if something terrible had happened to him? What if he was locked away in that house of horrors, unable to escape? I finally worked up the courage to drive by the Price home after school. Their car was in the driveway, but all the lights were off inside. I parked across the street, trying to decide on my next move. That's when I heard the screams from within the house. Agonizing wails muffled behind the closed front door. I called 911 in a panic before rushing to pound on the door myself. Mr. Price answered, his face scratched and bleeding, but he was smiling. "Danny is just playing with his friends," he said calmly. "No need to worry." I heard more screams and the sound of power tools revving from the open basement door behind him. Adrenaline shot through my veins. I shouldered past Mr. Price and sprinted down the stairs 2 at a time. The stench of chemicals and rotting meat slammed into me at the bottom. I stumbled to a stop, my mind reeling to process the horrific scene in front of me. Photographs covered one wall, showing dozens of victims in their final tortured moments. A workshop table on the other side displayed unfinished projects in various states of dissection and reassembly. And in the center were 2 small bodies strapped to tables, their lifeless eyes fixed on the ceiling. One of them was Danny. Behind me, a camera flashed as Karen captured my expression of abject shock and revulsion. Through my fog of horror, I realized this wasn't a killing room, it was an artist's studio, and I had just wandered in on their private exhibition. Gary stepped in front of the only exit, still smiling serenely. "You're just in time for the preview," he said, madness dancing in his eyes. "Welcome to our gallery showing." The taxidermy tools gleamed in his hands. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound escaped. Then everything went black. I must have lost consciousness from the shock and fumes, because the next thing I remember is waking up restrained to one of the tables, the blinding work light glaring down on me. Gary and Karen stood on either side, arranging their tools with delicate precision, as if preparing to make the first brushstroke on a pristine canvas. An artist's greatest work often goes unappreciated in their time, Gary mused, lovingly polishing a long, curved blade. "Luckily, we have a captive audience for our finest exhibition yet." He turned to me and winked. "It's a private showing, invitation only. And you, my dear, have a front row seat." Karen brought the camera up to her eye, framing me in the shot. "Smile for your close-up," she purred. "You're about to be immortalized as our magnum opus." The whir of the drill and my muffled screams faded under the clicks of the shutter as she documented my last moments. I'll never know what masterpiece of twisted flesh and bone they sculpted from my remains, because no one else has seen the Price's secret gallery and lived to tell the tale. Maybe one day their artwork will be discovered and gain the notoriety they craved. But for now, it remains hidden, waiting to lure in the next unwitting art lover foolish enough to stumble upon their exhibition of exquisite horrors. Take it from Maison galleries are better left unvisited. For once you see what lies behind the pristine facade, you can never unsee it. Their final work is on display in that basement as we speak. A pièce de résistance too terrible to imagine. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I swear I can still hear the whir of the drill and the click of the shutter, capturing beautifully depraved moments for all eternity in a private showing none of us were ever meant to see. What's scarier than the last story? This next one might just be the answer. The bell above the door chimed as the last customer of the night left the corner store. I sighed and rubbed my eyes, exhausted from another long shift. Glancing at my watch, I saw it was nearly 11 p.m. Time to close up shop. I went through my usual routine, counting the cash in the register, turning off the lights in the aisles, double-checking that the entrance was locked. The store felt eerie at night when it was empty and quiet. I always had the unshakable feeling that I wasn't alone, even though I knew I was the only one here. Well, the only living person, at least. This old building surely had its share of ghosts. The place had a dark history that I tried not to dwell on, but it crept into my thoughts more and more lately, especially after I found those stains in the stockroom last week. Rust-colored smears and spatters on the concrete floor, like a Jackson Pollock painting done in dried blood. I tried to tell myself it was just old motor oil or spilled paint, but I knew better. Something terrible had happened back there, maybe many terrible things over many years. I bought this little shop 8 months ago from the previous owner, an elderly man named Joe Kaufman who was eager to sell. Rumor was that old Joe left town abruptly after the sale went through. Packed a bag, hopped a bus, and hadn't been seen since. No forwarding address, no contact info. Like he wanted to disappear without a trace. People said he looked haunted near the end, always glancing over his shoulder, jumping at sudden noises. I figured he'd just grown tired of the daily grind and retired somewhere warm. Now I wasn't so sure. There was something cursed about this place. I sensed it more each day. At first, I shrugged off the unnerving feeling as my imagination. Too many late nights watching slasher flicks and reading creepypasta online. An overactive sense of impending doom, drummed into me by society's steady diet of grim headlines and sensationalized tragedy. This was the real world, after all. What was the worst that could happen here? But then the weird shit started. Little things at first. Items on shelves moved overnight. Muffled sounds from the walls. Fleeting shadows in mirrors. I told myself the building was just settling, that my mind was playing tricks. But the incidents kept piling up. Several times over the past month, I've gotten calls from the security company in the dead of night, alerted by the motion detectors. But each time I rushed over here, the store was still and silent. Nothing on the security cameras. No signs of entry. Just an eerie chill in the air and a skin-prickling certainty of unseen eyes upon me, of hushed footsteps stalking behind me in the dark. I started leaving the lights on overnight, though the electric bill was getting out of hand. Then there were the stains in the stockroom, spatters I couldn't scrub away no matter how hard I tried. The rust-colored smears seeped from the edges of the aging walk-in cooler. I told myself it was just oxidation. This place was ancient and falling apart. But one night, I worked up the nerve to pry open the cooler door, dreading what I might find. Inside, claw marks scored the metal walls, the ragged gouges sticky with old blood, the scene of a desperate, hopeless struggle. I slammed the door and tried to forget the grisly sight. Weird shit kept happening with the customers, too. More than a few remarked on feeling watched and unsafe in here. A young woman shivered and said the place gave her the creeps, like murderous eyes were boring into her spine. I laughed it off and said maybe it was a spooky ghost. She didn't smile back. The worst was when regulars stopped showing up. The quiet guy who came every evening for cigarettes and beer vanished without a trace. The single mom who counted on us for milk and eggs, MIA for over a week, her phone going straight to voicemail. Were they just busy, or did something awful happen to them? I had an unsettling hunch this store was the link, the common thread in their disappearances. A tiny voice in my head whispered that they'd met grim fates within these very walls, and it was only a matter of time before whatever malevolent force dwelled here came for me too. I tried to shake those morbid thoughts as I killed the lights and headed for the back room one last time. The night air felt heavy and oppressive, hinting at the approaching storm. In the stockroom I stopped short, my heart seizing as I noticed something that shouldn't be there. The walk-in cooler door gaped open, exhaling icy tendrils into the murky room. I knew I'd locked it, I always did, not wanting to see those horrible stains and gouges again. But now it stood ajar, a rectangle of yawning blackness defying me to enter. My pulse pounded as I took a halting step closer. I told myself the latch must have failed, that the seal finally gave out on the ancient fridge. But some primal intuition warned me it was much worse than that. Something lurked in that void, a malevolent presence that had marked me for its next victim. With a trembling hand, I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight. I needed to stop being a chicken shit and just lock the damn door. It was late, and I was letting my mind run wild with the absurd fears of a child afraid of the boogeymen in their closet. Except my monsters were real, and they were already here. I stepped into the freezing space, breath fogging in the swirling mist. The weak beam of my phone slashed through the darkness, catching on a nightmarish sight. The back wall of the cooler had crumbled away, revealing a gaping tunnel mouth, exhaling the stench of blood and decay. Symbols marred the crumbling bricks, esoteric sigils scrawled in viscous grime. They shimmered darkly in the quivering light, bold slashes and whorls like the frenzied scratchings of a madman, or a thing beyond the feeble grasps of sanity. The rough-hewn passageway bored into the bedrock, vanishing into a void that had never known the sun. I stood paralyzed, the cold burning in my lungs as I fought the sudden certainty I was moments from death. The shadows writhed, far-off scrapes and slithers betraying the approach of God only knew what horror crept forth. Fear urged me to run, but morbid curiosity dragged my feet forward, a moth drawn to oblivion's flame. With numb, dreamlike motions, I ducked through the shattered wall into the tunnel. My phone created a wan halo in the unnatural darkness, enough to glimpse the source of the ungodly reek. Bones littered the uneven floor, some ancient, others horribly fresh, all bearing the unmistakable marks of gnawing teeth. I followed the charnel trail deeper into the labyrinth beneath the store, my ragged breaths and squelching steps the only sounds in the cloying silence. The air grew more putrid and oppressive with each yard, as if the very earth strove to suffocate me. I didn't know what I sought in this pit, only that I couldn't turn back. Not now. Not after the vanished customers, the telltale stains, the lies old Kaufman had spewed to unload this cursed shop upon me. I needed answers, even if they destroyed me. The tunnel branched and wound, a buried maze conjured from a lunatic's nightmares. Passages terminated in small chambers piled with moldering bones. Alcoves gaped like hungry mouths, eager to swallow me whole. Some sick pattern hinted at premeditation behind the madness, a malign intelligence designing this abyss as a sadistic temple, or an abattoir to sate its endless gluttony. After an eternity of increasingly desperate wandering, I stumbled into a larger cavern. A foul, slimy altar squatted in the center, a monolith of pulsing obsidian veined with unholy luminescence. My phone tumbled from my hand and shattered, plunging me into Stygian twilight, broken only by the altar's clonic glow. A whimpering mule made me whirl toward the far wall. There, manacled to the fetid stone, sagged the missing checkout girl from the store down the road. She stared at me with pleading, hopeless eyes, her cracked lips mouthing silent words. Then a huge, dark shape blotted her out, an undulating mass of writhing shadow and grasping limbs, shearing her cry into a wet, suddenly silenced gurgle. I ran then, ran until the meager light faded and true darkness took me. Ran until my heart hammered fit to explode and my legs gave out in a crash of pain and futility. I huddled there in the stinking bowels of the abyss as the skittering, gibbering thing closed in, my mind teetering on the crumbling precipice of madness. It found me, as I knew it would, as it had found the others, as it would keep finding us, culling the herd of humanity to feed its unnatural hunger. The glistening black limbs lifted me with almost tender care, a parody of a lover's caress before the consummation. Yellowed teeth flashed, a needle-fanged rictus grin in the endless night. I felt the first razor edges pierce my skin, knowing my blood would soon paint the altar in tribute. In the distance, the last chime echoed as the thing that had once been old Joe Kaufman locked the front door of the corner store for the night. The neon open sign sputtered out, leaving only an inverted black void where once a simple neighborhood shop promised safe harbor. But that was a lie. Like all the others we tell ourselves. The horrors are already here, smiling as they ring up our groceries and bag our sundries. And now, they have fresh meat for the larder. The feeding never stops after all. Only the location changes from time to time. Cower now, as the dark closes in. As tooth and claw shred skin to ribbons. As your screams echo unheard through these uncaring walls. There is no escape from the beasts within. They have always been here, waiting, hungering, beneath the surface of the lives we know. You survived the last story, but will you survive the next? I've been an apprentice mortician at Everlast Funeral Home for about 6 months now. It's not exactly my dream job, but it pays the bills while I'm in school. My boss, Mr. Landon, is an odd duck. He's always lurking around, watching me work, never saying much beyond grunts and cryptic instructions. Still, I figured that's just how he is. At least until I started noticing things that don't add up around here. It started innocently enough, a few extra bodies showing up without the usual intake paperwork. When I asked Mr. Landon about it, he waved me off, said it was some special services for private clients who wanted discretion. I didn't think much of it at the time. Rich folks are eccentric. Who am I to judge? But then it kept happening, almost every week. Sometimes 2 or 3 extra cadavers would be wheeled in through the back. No documentation, no explanation. I'd find them tucked into the cold storage, squeezed between the legitimate cases. When I pressed Mr. Landon again, he got agitated, told me to quit asking questions and just do my job. I could see a nervous energy in his eyes that set me on edge. But what was I supposed to do? Go to the cops and tell them my boss might be stashing mystery bodies in the mortuary freezers? They'd laugh me out of the station. So I kept my head down and my mouth shut until a few nights ago. I was on a late shift, had just finished prepping Mrs. Ellington for her viewing the next morning. The rest of the staff had gone home, but I stayed to tidy up the embalming room. As I was cleaning, I heard something, the faint squeak of a gurney wheel, coming from the loading bay. I figured it was just Mr. Landon with another one of his private clients. Against my better judgment, I crept down the hall to take a look. I peered through the small window into the dock area. Mr. Landon was there, but he wasn't alone. Two big guys in dark clothes were with him, and they were hauling a large black bag out of an unmarked van, the kind of bag you transport a body in. I watched as they laid it out on a metal table. Mr. Landon unzipped the bag, and I had to stifle a gasp. Inside was the body of a young woman, her dark hair matted, angry purple marks around her throat. This was no elderly grandma who passed peacefully in the night. She had been strangled. My heart hammered as I ducked out of view, mind racing. What the hell was I witnessing? Was Mr. Landon mixed up with murderers? I risked another glance. The two thugs were handing Mr. Landon an envelope filled with cash. He counted it greedily, then waved them off. As quietly as I could, I hurried back to the embalming room, hands shaking. I didn't know what to do. Confront him? Call the police? Would they even believe me? I stood paralyzed with indecision, until a cold voice behind me said, "I told you not to ask questions, David." I whirled to see Mr. Landon in the doorway, fury smoldering behind his grim expression. "Sir, let me explain." "Oh, I think I understand perfectly," he said, stepping closer. "You couldn't leave well enough alone, could you? Always poking around in the affairs of your betters." "Sir, please," I pleaded, backing away. "What you're doing, it's not right. It's illegal. You can't just disappear people like this." He lunged forward suddenly, slamming me against the wall, hands around my throat. "Stupid boy, you think I'm some lightweight? I have powerful friends who depend on my services. No one will question a few extra urns of ashes, especially from a nosy apprentice who met an unfortunate accident." I struggled as his grip tightened, spots dancing in my vision. I could smell the nicotine on his breath, see the homicidal gleam in his eye. With my last ounce of strength, I kicked out desperately, my foot connecting with his knee. He grunted in pain and let go as his leg buckled. I ran, coughing and gasping. I fled down the hall, Mr. Landon's enraged shouts echoing behind me. I darted into the main viewing room, scanning for an exit. But in my panic, I took a wrong turn, stumbling instead into the crematorium antechamber, the massive oven looming before me. I heard his footsteps, slow and deliberate, stalking closer. "David, there's nowhere to run, son. You're only making this harder on yourself." Frantic, I looked around. There, a small closet where we stored the cremains of the indigent deceased, whose families couldn't afford urns. I dove inside amidst the boxes of generic aluminum canisters, pulling the door shut and holding my breath. I could see him through the small gap, prowling the room, hunting me. "You think you can ruin me, boy? I have the ashes of 100 secrets in those urns, every one a nail I could put in some powerful coffin if I chose. That buys me a lot of favors, a lot of loyalty. What do you have besides a big mouth?" He paced in front of my hiding place, taunting me. "Nothing, that's what. You're just a useless orphan playing at a job while chasing an empty dream. Who would miss you? Who would even notice you're gone?" I squeezed my eyes shut, trembling. He was right. I was alone in this world, no family to speak of. If I died, I'd just be another urn on the shelf, my remains mixed with the forsaken and the forgotten. No, a small voice inside me rebelled against that fate. I wouldn't let this monster turn me to dust. I had to fight, even if it was my last act. I put my hand on the door, waiting for him to turn his back. One chance, a mad dash for freedom. Sirens, The sudden wail of police sirens filled the air. Red and blue light flashed through the frosted glass, and the screech of tires sounded out front. I sagged against the boxes in disbelief. Somehow, someone knew. Someone had called the cops. I almost cried with relief. I heard Mr. Landon curse foully. No, no, no. He ran out of the room to the front of the building. I waited a few breathless moments, then bolted from my hiding spot. I dashed down the halls to the rear fire exit. As I pushed out into the cool night air, I glimpsed 2 police officers with guns drawn, shouting at Mr. Landon as he stood by his black funeral director's sedan, hands raised. I kept running, out into the darkness, leaving the horror of Everlast Funeral Home behind me. The air stung in my lungs and the wind whipped tears down my cheeks as the adrenaline faded. But I kept going, until the only sound was my pounding heart and the throb of the city at night. I don't know who tipped off the cops, or how much they uncovered. Part of me hopes they never find all of Mr. Landon's secrets. I know I'll never be able to forget the faces of the special clients that passed through those dark halls. I'm haunted by the thought of what my own fate might have been. I dropped out of mortuary school after that. I moved cities, found a new path. But to this day, when I see a hearse idling outside a church or catch the scent of funeral lilies on the breeze, I shudder at the memory of how close I came to being just another unclaimed urn on a dusty shelf, a mislaid soul among so many, the misconduct of evil men covered over with dirt and ash and silence. That was only the beginning. The real terror starts now. I've worked at the Millfield Public Library for 6 years now. It's a peaceful job, for the most part. Shelving books, helping patrons find what they need, running the occasional children's reading event. The usual. But lately, things have felt off. It started a few months ago. I was sorting through a cart of returns and a book caught my eye, The Collector by John Fowles. Its dust jacket was torn and hanging loose. When I opened the front cover to check the library card pocket, a folded sheet of lined paper slipped out and fluttered to the floor. Probably just an old checkout receipt, I figured. But when I unfolded it, I froze. Scrawled in messy handwriting was a list of names, dozens of them, and next to each name was a physical description: height, weight, hair color, what they were wearing. With growing unease, I realized I recognized some of the names. They were regular patrons. There was Aiden, the shy teenager who always checked out fantasy novels. Priya, the young mother who brought her twin toddlers to story time each week. Mr. Novak, the elderly widower who read the newspaper in the armchairs every afternoon. Why would someone be keeping such detailed notes on library patrons? A cold dread crept over me. I quickly searched the rest of the book, but found nothing else suspicious. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was probably just the eccentric scribblings of an odd patron. Libraries attract all types. But still, I couldn't shake the disturbed feeling as I continued my work that day. Over the coming weeks, more unsettling things started happening. It began with the sounds at night. After closing time, when only the night librarian and security guard Jim remained, soft noises would emanate from deep within the library. The thump of footsteps slowly pacing the stacks, the muffled clatter of books being moved on shelves. I asked Jim if he had noticed anything unusual. He grumbled that it was probably just the old building settling as it cooled down for the night. I wanted to believe him. But then I started noticing books appearing in strange places. Volumes that belonged in philosophy would inexplicably be shelved in children's lit. A tattered world atlas was wedged behind the public computer monitors. When I went to purge the list of long overdue titles one day, I discovered that many of the books were ones I had never seen checked out before. Where had they disappeared to for months? I was baffled. Things escalated when I found the first gift. Tucked in the return bin one morning was a small velvet jewelry box. Inside was a delicate gold locket engraved with flowers. It looked old and expensive. There was no note. When I asked around, none of the other librarians knew anything about it. I turned it in to the lost and found. But the gifts kept appearing. A few days later, I found an antique compact mirror inlaid with mother-of-pearl left on my cart. Then came a tortoiseshell hair comb, a silk scarf with a musky perfume scent, a silver charm bracelet. None of it made any sense. Puzzled, I took the items to my manager. She was just as perplexed. We speculated that maybe a patron had developed a misguided crush on one of the female librarians and was leaving anonymous presents. But something didn't sit right. The presents seemed too personal, like they had once belonged to someone. It gave me a sick feeling I couldn't explain. Then the notes started. They would appear on my desk in the morning, stuck to my computer monitor, slipped under my door. Each one was a cryptic, vaguely threatening poem. Things like, Dewey's decimals track the tomes, but other numbers fester, names and dates and times unknown. Within these walls sequester. I didn't understand what they meant, but they made my skin crawl. The other librarians found similar strange notes. No one had any idea who was leaving them. Around that same time, some of our regular patrons stopped showing up. At first, I didn't think much of it, but as the weeks went by, I realized I hadn't seen Priya and her twins at story time in over a month. Mr. Novak no longer occupied his favorite armchair each afternoon. Aiden's fantasy holds sat unclaimed in the reserve stacks. Had they all simply moved away? It seemed like an odd coincidence. With a sinking feeling, I thought back to the list of names I had found. I dug it out of my desk drawer with shaking hands. Reading through the names and descriptions again, my blood ran cold. Every single patron who had recently disappeared was on that list. Panicked, I took my concerns to the library director, but he brushed me off, saying that patrons' reading habits and personal lives were none of our business. Frustrated, I decided to investigate on my own. Using my employee access, I searched the names from the list in our patron database. Most of them had one unsettling thing in common. The last activity on their accounts was checking out books from our closed stacks archive. I took the creaking elevator down to the dusty, dimly lit basement where we kept those old books. As I entered the musty rows, a floorboard creaked behind me. I spun around to see Jim, the security guard, standing at the end of the aisle. He gave me an unnerving smile. "Find what you're looking for," he asked in an oily voice. I stammered something about needing an old reference volume. He stared at me for a long moment, then turned and walked away. I exhaled shakily. With trembling fingers, I pulled the ancient books from the shelves. They all fell open to certain dog-eared pages, as if they had been read over and over. As I read the yellowed pages, an icy horror dawned on me. The books detailed macabre rituals, human sacrifices, trophy-taking murders. My stomach lurched as I realized the books contained photographs, photos of the missing patrons. There was a Polaroid of Aiden bound and gagged, his eyes wide with terror, Mr. Novak lifeless and slumped in his armchair, blood pooling from his slashed throat. And Priya, her broken body splayed at the bottom of the library's dumbwaiter shaft. Shaking uncontrollably now, I flipped to the back page. There, in fresh ink, were names, dates, and locations, a ledger of death, and at the very bottom, today's date. With my name, a floorboard creaked again. I looked up to see Jim walking toward me, a feral grin on his face, a long knife clutched in his hand. "You just couldn't leave it alone, could you?" he hissed, his eyes gleaming with perverse pleasure. "They never do. That's what makes this so much fun." I bolted, frantically careening through the stacks. He lunged for me, knocking over shelves with a crash. I could hear his ragged breaths as his footsteps pounded closer. I flew up the stairs, sprinting for the front doors. But they were locked. I screamed for help, but no one was there. Jim advanced on me, chuckling darkly. "There's nowhere to run, Jennifer. Haven't you figured it out yet? No one ever really leaves the library." I scrambled away, darting down a hallway. I saw an open doorway to my left, the abandoned book drop room. In desperation, I flung myself inside, slamming and locking the door behind me just as Jim crashed into it with a howl of rage. I collapsed to the floor, gasping and sobbing, but as I looked around the room, my breath caught in my throat. There, piled in the corner, were the missing patrons, Their glassy eyes stared at me in frozen horror, their mangled bodies stuffed into shelves and bins like discarded books. Jim pounded on the door, hurling threats. I huddled against the wall, trapped. Then I noticed a book splayed open on the floor. The Collector. With a trembling hand, I picked it up. There, in the inside cover, was a new list. A list with only one name. Mine. And now I'm still here, hiding among the corpses, praying that someone finds this story. Because as long as these words survive, maybe some part of me does too. Maybe there's still a chance to stop him. But more than anything, I just want someone to know the truth about what happened at Millfield Public Library, about the librarian who collected people instead of books. Before I become just another overdue statistic, another trophy in the stacks. You think you've seen it all? The next story will prove you wrong. I've been a dance instructor for 15 years now. It's my passion, my life. When the opportunity came up to buy the old Rosewood Dance Studio last spring, I jumped at the chance. Sure, the place needed a lot of work, but it had such history, such character. I poured my savings into renovations, determined to restore it to its former glory. The first few months were a dream. My adult classes filled up quickly with eager students, progressing from beginner waltz to advanced tango. I relished unlocking the potential in each dancer, the same joy I'd felt for years. But then, peculiar things started happening. It began small, a student's misplaced dance bag, a window left cracked open. I chalked it up to my own distraction, burning the midnight oil to keep the studio thriving. Then Vanessa, one of my star pupils, stopped showing up to class. No call, no email. Just gone, like a ghost slipping into the shadows. I tried contacting her, but her number was disconnected. I assumed she'd moved away. Dancers are prone to flitting off, chasing their next adventure. Except it kept happening. Every few weeks, another advanced student would vanish, always without a word, like they'd never existed at all. I pored over my ledgers, searching for a pattern, but found only question marks. One chilly October evening, I stayed late to catch up on paperwork. The ancient radiators pinged and hissed, echoing through the empty halls. As I sat hunched over my desk, a whisper of music drifted up from below, faint strains of Tchaikovsky, the kind of faded melody you'd hear from a vintage music box. Puzzled, I crept downstairs, my heels clacking too loudly against the scuffed wood. The music seemed to be emanating from the basement, a dank, low-ceilinged space I rarely ventured into. Flicking on the weak light, I inched forward, the musty air pressing in close. Thud, creak, thud. The noises reverberated from the far wall, as if someone was shifting heavy furniture on the other side. My heart stammered. The building was deserted, I was sure of it. Clenching my hands to stop their trembling, I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" Silence. Even the music had faded, like a phonograph winding down. Then, right next to my ear, an icy gust of laughter. I whirled, but caught only my own wild-eyed reflection in the old mirrors lining the walls. Mirrors, I suddenly realized, had a strange depth to them, a murkiness that could hide untold secrets. A terrible unease shuddered through me. I fled upstairs, not stopping until I'd locked the studio tight behind me. My scattered thoughts kept circling back to those vanished students. What if? No, it was too absurd. But I couldn't shake the uncanny sense that the studio was more than it appeared. Over the next weeks, I took to studying the old building plans, searching for any clue to the mystery. One sleepless night, a tiny notation on the blueprints leaped out at me. Concealed passages inside the walls, leading to hidden observation rooms behind the basement mirrors. Rooms someone could lurk in, unseen. My blood ran cold. It had to be connected to the missing dancers. But who was skulking in the bowels of my studio? I scoured local archives, piecing together the building's dark history. The story of Lawrence Delvaux emerged, like an insidious rot spreading beneath Rosewood. A world-renowned ballet master in the 1920s, 1940s, famous for plucking star pupils from obscurity and driving them to greatness, until accusations of obsession and abuse ended his career. The man dropped off the map, presumed dead for decades. But the faded property deeds and blurry photos told a different tale. They whispered of a shrunken old man who had purchased the studio shortly before his supposed death, a man whose silhouette matched the glimpses I'd caught in the basement shadows. I could hardly fathom it. Was the former owner, rumored to be fixated on molding perfect dancers to his vision, still living inside these walls? The final chilling puzzle piece clicked into place last week. I was locking up after rehearsal when a muffled thump sounded from below. This time, dread-filled as I was, I crept down to investigate. There, in a sub-basement room I'd never noticed before, I found the unthinkable. Brittle, ancient Delvaux, withered as a mummy, arranging delicate poses on the emaciated bodies of my missing students. Their limbs, broken and restrung, contorted into macabre marionettes in an eerie preservation room. "My perfect dancers," he croaked, "preserved for eternity, never aging, immune to the flaws of mortal flesh. Can you see their beauty?" His skeletal finger jabbed at me. "And you, my dear, shall make a fine final addition to the tableau." I hurled myself up the stairs, Delvaux's spidery footsteps skittering behind me. I slammed the door just in time, his grasping fingers catching in the jamb. I fled into the night and haven't dared go back, but I still hear the music in my dreams, the thumps and creaks behind the walls, and I wonder how long those dancers will prance in Delvaux's morbid studio, and if my own final recital awaits. Just when you thought it couldn't get worse, the next story takes you deeper into the nightmare. I'll never forget the summer I worked construction on the old Belmont Hotel renovation. It was just a job to me at first, gutting and rebuilding the interior of the historic building to make way for new shops and office space. Little did I know the dark secrets that lay buried within those walls. It all started when I was clearing out one of the old storage rooms in the basement. Tucked away in a corner, I found a stack of vintage leather suitcases covered in decades of dust and cobwebs. Curious, I hauled them out to take a closer look. The latches were rusted shut, but with some effort I managed to pry the largest one open. Inside was a meticulously organized collection of old papers, photographs, news clippings, and handwritten journals. As I leafed through the contents, a chill ran down my spine. The suitcase belonged to a man named Samuel Graymont, who had worked as a bellhop at the hotel from the 1920s to the 1940s. But these were no ordinary mementos. Page after page detailed brutal murders carried out by Graymont during his time at the Belmont. He described stalking his victims, hotel guests and staff alike, studying their habits and routines. Then he would strike, strangling them in their suites or bludgeoning them in the service corridors. With cold, meticulous precision, he recorded each kill, including names, dates, room numbers, and grisly trophy photographs. What disturbed me most was the final entry, where Graymont outlined his plans to hide the bodies. He was sealing them up inside the hotel walls, in the very spaces I was now tearing apart. The thought made me sick to my stomach. I knew I should go to the police, but something stopped me. Morbid curiosity, perhaps, or some strange sense of connection to the dark history of the building. Whatever the reason, I kept Graymont's secret, continuing work as if nothing had changed. But then I met the hotel's maintenance man, an older gentleman named Philip Graymont. It didn't take much digging to discover he was Samuel's son. At first, I thought it was just a morbid coincidence. Then I started noticing Philip watching me, studying my movements just like his father stalking his prey in those old journals. A cold dread crept over me as I realized Philip knew I had found the suitcases, and he didn't intend to let his father's secrets die. Last week, I stayed late to work on the 4th floor alone. Sometime after midnight, I heard the ding of the old service elevator at the end of the hall. I went to investigate, and there was Philip, standing in the open doors with a twisted smile on his face. The elevator wasn't even supposed to be operational. "I've been keeping an eye on you, Thomas," he said in an eerily calm voice. "I saw you find my father's collection. Shame you had to go poking around in business that doesn't concern you." I stumbled backward as he advanced out of the elevator, a hammer clutched in his fist. "You know, there's still room for a few more bodies in these walls," Philip continued. "My father taught me well. Room service is so convenient for cleanup, isn't it? I bolted for the stairs, Philip's footsteps pounding behind me. I lost him somewhere on the second floor and managed to escape into the night. But I know he's still there, waiting. I haven't been back to work since. The police investigated, but found nothing conclusive, of course. Philip is too smart to leave evidence behind. It's been a week and no sign of him, but I can't shake the feeling I'm being watched. I jump at every sound, see his face in every shadow. Part of me wants to go back and tear those walls down myself, expose the horrors interred there, but I'm afraid of what I might find, or rather, what might find me. Philip is still out there, I'm sure of it, watching, waiting. Someday, I fear I'll hear that old service elevator ding again, and it won't be room service that greets me when the doors slide open. If the last story gave you goosebumps, the next one will leave you breathless. I'll never forget the summer I worked construction on the old Belmont Hotel renovation. It was just a job to me at first, gutting and rebuilding the interior of the historic building to make way for new shops and office space. Little did I know the dark secrets that lay buried within those walls. It all started when I was clearing out one of the old storage rooms in the basement, a cramped space that smelled of mold and decay. Tucked away in a corner, hidden behind a jumble of rotting wooden crates and rusty equipment, I found a stack of vintage leather suitcases covered in decades of dust and cobwebs. They seemed out of place among the debris, too well preserved to have been abandoned with the rest of the junk. Curious, I hauled them out into the dim light to take a closer look. The latches were rusted shut, but with some effort and a screwdriver from my tool belt, I managed to pry the largest one open. The hinges screamed in protest, cracking and flaking under the strain. Inside was a meticulously organized collection of old papers, photographs, news clippings, and handwritten journals, all yellowed and brittle with age. A musty smell wafted up, tickling my nose and making my eyes water. As I leafed through the contents, a chill ran down my spine, colder than the damp air of the basement. The suitcase belonged to a man named Samuel Graymont, according to the monogrammed initials on the lining. Records showed he had worked as a bellhop at the hotel from the 1920s to the 1940s. But these were no ordinary mementos of a long career. Page after page detailed brutal murders carried out by Graymont during his time at the Belmont. In tight, precise handwriting that never wavered, he described stalking his victims, hotel guests and staff alike. He studied their habits and routines, memorizing their schedules and noting their vulnerabilities. Then, when the moment was right, he would strike, strangling them with a garrote in their suites late at night, or bludgeoning them with a lead pipe in the deserted service corridors. The attacks were swift and ruthless, leaving behind no trace of a struggle. With cold, meticulous precision, Graymont recorded each kill in his journals, listing names, dates, room numbers, and even including grisly trophy photographs of his handiwork. Battered faces and lifeless eyes stared up at me from the faded pages, the images still sharp despite the passage of time. He described the rush of power he felt, the thrill of holding his victim's fate in his hands. It was clear from his writings that he viewed these murders as his life's grand purpose. What disturbed me most was the final entry, where Graymont outlined his plans to dispose of the bodies. He couldn't risk them being discovered, so he had devised a chilling solution. Room by room, he was sealing the corpses up inside the very walls of the hotel, entombing them in the spaces between the elegant facades. The thick masonry muffled any smells, and the outdated blueprints disguised any alteration. It was the perfect hiding place, Graymont gloated, a mausoleum of his own design that would keep his secrets for eternity. I felt bile rise in my throat as I realized I was now tearing apart the walls that concealed his grim handiwork. The thought of what I might uncover made my skin crawl. Somewhere behind the rotting plaster and dusty beams, an untold number of Graymont's victims lie moldering, their disappearances never solved. I knew I should go straight to the police, turn over the suitcases and all the evidence inside. But something stopped me. A morbid curiosity I couldn't quite shake, or perhaps some strange sense of connection to the dark history embedded in the building's bones. Whatever the reason, I repacked the cases and stashed them carefully out of sight. Against my better judgment, I kept Greymont's secret, locked away with the rest of the hotel's skeletons, as I continued working like nothing had changed. But I couldn't banish Greymont's presence from my mind as I worked, imagining him prowling the halls, lying in wait for his next victim. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of a draft through the eaves, set my nerves on edge. I listened for ghostly taps and scratches inside the walls, my imagination conjuring dead fingers clawing at the plaster and moldy bones shifting in the dark. The hotel took on a sinister air, as if resenting my intrusion on its grim secrets. Then I met the hotel's old maintenance man, an elderly gentleman named Philip Greymont. It didn't take much digging in the historical records to discover Philip was the son of Samuel, the deranged killer whose suitcases I now possessed. At first I thought it must be an awful coincidence, the family name synonymous with the hotel's darkest chapter. Then I started noticing Philip watching me, following my movements through the gutted halls and desolate rooms, just like his father had stalked his victims all those decades ago. In his watery, faded blue eyes I saw a keen intelligence appraising me, a cold calculation that made the hairs on my neck stand up. Philip had the same gaunt features and pale skin as the man in the old photographs, the spitting image of Samuel with 60 more years of cunning and cruelty etched in the lines of his face. He moved through the hotel on silent feet, despite his age, startling me around corners, his face always set in an expression of mildly disdainful amusement. He'd worked in the hotel his entire life, as much a part of it as the brick and wood, and I had the unnerving sense that it was loyal to him above all else, like a faithful dog serving its twisted master. A creeping dread came over me as I realized Philip knew I had discovered his father's suitcases and their grisly contents. The strange looks, the feeling of being watched and followed, he was toying with me, letting me marinate in my rising fear. I recalled Samuel's interest in his victim's terror in those last moments. The apple, it seemed, had not fallen far from the tree. Philip had no intention of letting me expose the sins of the past. One way or another, his father's secrets would stay buried. Last week, I stayed late to work on the old fourth floor alone, installing drywall in a long vacant wing. The Belmont had been a grand hotel once, an Art Deco palace sheathed in marble and gilt, but now the gutted interior felt more like a tomb, echoing and empty. The only light came from a few hissing work lamps and the pale glow of the moon through gaping window frames. The rest was lost in shadow. Sometime after midnight, as I pushed my cart of tools down the silent corridor, I heard the ding of the old service elevator at the far end of the hall. The noise shocked me to my core. That elevator had been shut down since the 60s, deemed too costly to maintain. It wasn't supposed to be functional at all, much less running in the dead of night. Heart pounding, I went to investigate. There, standing in the open doors like a corporeal shadow, was Philip Greymont. The flickering fluorescent light behind him cast his craggy face in an eerie half-light. He looked at me over the rims of his glasses, his thin lips parted in a smile that held no warmth. "Burning the midnight oil, Thomas?" he asked in a voice like rustling leaves. Funny, I thought I was the only one left in the old girl tonight. I stood frozen, my tongue stuck to the roof of my mouth. Philip stepped out of the elevator, still smiling that horrible smile. Something gleamed in his gnarled fist, peeking out between his fingers. With mounting dread, I realized it was the polished claw of a hammer. "I've been keeping an eye on you, Thomas," he continued in that same calm, conversational tone. "I saw you find my father's little collection the other day, poking around in business that doesn't concern you. You know what they say about curiosity and the cat." His voice never rose, but malice dripped from every word. I stumbled backward on watery legs as he advanced, my heart galloping in my chest. Behind him, the antique elevator gaped like an open wound. Now, Thomas, don't do anything foolish," Philip said. "You know there's still plenty of room for a few more lost souls in these walls. My father taught me well. It's the perfect racket who questions a few mysterious disappearances in a hotel. Room service is so very convenient for cleanup." His eyes glittered with a madness that froze my blood. I knew with absolute certainty I was staring into the eyes of a monster, one who had lurked in the shadows of the Belmont for decades, just waiting for the chance to continue his father's gruesome legacy. Blind animal panic took over. I bolted for the stairs, not daring to wait for the main elevator. Behind me, Philip's footsteps rang against the hardwood, slow and unhurried. He was savoring the hunt. "You can't run from your fate, Thomas," he called, his voice bouncing off the close walls. "This hotel and I have an understanding." Flight after flight I ran, expecting any moment to feel the crunch of the hammer's head against my skull, or Philip's liver-spotted hands closing around my throat. But I reached the ground floor without further sign of him. In the moonlit lobby, I sprinted past the sheet-draped furniture, running for the doors and the safety of the street. At the threshold, I glanced back just in time to see Philip step out of the shadows under the balcony, his face ghostly pale, hammer still clutched in his fist. He lifted it towards me in a mocking salute. "Until next time, Thomas," he mouthed, teeth gleaming in the dark. "Keep our little secret now." Then he melted back into the shadows, as much a part of the Belmont as its bricks and beams. I stood shaking on the sidewalk, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and tried to convince myself it had all been a nightmare. But I knew better. I fled into the night and haven't been back to the Belmont since. The police investigated, but just as Philip had predicted, they found nothing, no conclusive evidence of Graymont's long-ago crimes, and no sign of Philip himself. I kept the suitcases, hoping they might protect me somehow if I ever found the courage to bring them to light. But as the days turned to weeks, no amount of locked doors or daylight could shake the sense of being watched, of being hunted. I know Philip is out there, as patient and methodical as his father. When I walk down the street, I feel his eyes on the back of my neck. When I peer out my windows at night, I imagine I see his pale face looking back from the shadows. Even in my dreams, I hear the ding of that antique elevator, a harbinger of doom. I want to tell myself it's all in my head, that Philip couldn't possibly know where I live. But deep down, I know better. A man who has spent his entire life cleaning up after a serial killer doesn't leave loose ends. He is a predator, and I am his unfinished business. Part of me is tempted to go back to the Belmont with a sledgehammer, to tear down the walls myself and bring Graymont's secrets to light. Philip be damned. But I can't shake the certainty that he'd be waiting for me, as if the hotel itself would deliver me into his hands. It's his domain, his killing floor, and the thought of descending into that basement again fills me with a sick, gut-churning dread. And so I remain in limbo, wondering when Philip will make his next move, when I'll hear the ding of the elevator, or feel the cold kiss of steel against my skin. I dream of confinement, of being trapped in a dark, airless place with bones for company, sealed up in the walls like all the Graymont's victims before me. It's only a matter of time, I'm sure of it. There's no escaping the Belmont's hungry ghosts, or the living monster still walking its halls waiting for his moment to strike. If you thought that was chilling, the next story might just send shivers down your spine. It started as just another summer in the old Victorian house I'd inherited from my grandmother. At 68, I was enjoying my peaceful retirement, tending to the lush gardens that had been in the family for generations. Being a botanist, it was the perfect way to spend my golden years. But then, peculiar things began happening in the garden. Vibrant flowers and robust vegetables sprouted up in beds I swore I hadn't planted. The growth was unusually fast, and the plants were larger than any I'd seen before. At first I thought it was just an exceptionally good season, but then it got stranger. My neighbors started commenting on my impressive harvests. I shared the bounty with them, happy to spread the joy. But soon after, the Robinsons next door and old Mrs. Larkin across the street stopped coming around. I figured they were busy, or maybe even a bit jealous. As the summer wore on, my garden only grew more abundant, but a sense of unease crept over me, sending a chill down my spine despite the warm sun. I started digging into the history of the house, scouring old papers in the attic. What I discovered made my blood run cold. Every previous occupant, all from my family line, had died after their gardens experienced an uncanny surge in growth. The official causes varied: accidents, illnesses, even a few suicides. But the pattern was undeniable. The house and its garden seemed to demand a sacrifice. With trembling hands, I ventured out back to the ancient family cemetery. I'd never paid it much mind, but now I had to know. Clawing at the soil, my heart raced as I realized the awful truth. The graves were empty. No coffins, no bones, just damp earth. As I knelt there, paralyzed with terror, the ground beneath me began to shift. Roots, thick and gnarled, emerged from the depths, slowly encircling my ankles. The plants I'd nurtured so lovingly suddenly seemed sinister, reaching for me with malevolent intent. I wrenched myself free and stumbled back to the house, my mind reeling. For generations, this property had been feeding on the blood of my ancestors. Now it wanted me. Shaking, I peer out at my garden of horrors, knowing I'll soon have to make a terrible choice. Do I succumb like those before me and nourish this ravenous plot? Or do I resist and risk becoming the next one laid to rest beneath the hungry soil? The plants sway gently in the breeze, and I swear I can hear them whispering my name. I lock the door, close the curtains, and huddle in the dimness. But I know my days are numbered, one way or the other, here in this house that tends its own. The last tale was only the beginning. The real terror starts now. The day had finally come. After 2 long months of sorting through Mom's things, deep cleaning and fixing up the place, 611 Oakwood Drive was ready for its first open house. As I drove over to my childhood home, a wave of nostalgia and grief hit me. It felt strange going there, knowing Mom wouldn't be puttering around in the kitchen or tending to her rose bushes out front. But I took a deep breath and told myself this is what she would have wanted. To see another family breathe new life into the old colonial and make their own memories here. I pulled into the familiar driveway and gazed up at the house. Freshly painted white siding, black shutters, the realtor's sign staked in the pristine lawn. But something seemed off. Were the hedges always that overgrown, that gnarled oak tree looming larger than I remembered? I shook my head. Just nerves, I told myself. The place was in great shape, I'd made sure of that. After grabbing my briefcase and straightening my tie, I walked up the steps to the front door. The old brass key turned smoothly in the lock. The door swung open with a long creak, and I was greeted by the familiar scent of the house: pine cleaner, coffee, and something else. Something dank and musty I couldn't quite place. Had the dehumidifier stopped running? Flicking on the lights, I began my usual rounds, checking that everything was in order before the potential buyers arrived. Living room looked cozy and inviting, kitchen gleaming and modern. I climbed the curved staircase, wooden steps groaning underfoot, to survey the second floor. But when I reached the top landing, I froze. Directly in front of me was a door that had never been there before. My heart started racing. This had to be some mistake. I knew every inch of this house. There was only supposed to be 3 bedrooms and a bath up here. With a trembling hand, I turned the antique glass knob and the door swung open. Cold, musty air wafted out, and I peered into pitch darkness, fumbling for a light switch. When I finally found it, and the room flooded with weak yellow light, my blood ran cold. It was a bedroom, but not like any I had ever seen in this house. The walls were papered with a garish floral print, peeling and faded. A 4-poster bed sat in the center, its canopy hanging in dusty tatters. My eyes landed on an old wooden dresser. Resting on top was a small framed photo. I picked it up with shaking fingers and wiped away the film of grime. As I studied the black and white image, a chill ran down my spine. It was a family portrait, my great-grandparents and their children, arrayed stiffly in their Sunday best. That itself wasn't unusual. But behind them, peeking out from the faded background, was another face. The face of the woman who had come to that very first open house. The one whose body was later found in the basement, though the doors had been locked from the inside. I dropped the photo and backed out of the room, heart pounding. This wasn't possible. That woman, she had only seen the house a week ago, yet there she was, trapped like a pale specter behind the glass. The doorbell rang then, nearly making me jump out of my skin. I raced downstairs, hastily shutting the mystery door behind me. Breathless, I opened the front door to a young, smiling couple. "Hi there. We're the Bensons," the husband said brightly, sticking out his hand. "We've been so looking forward to seeing the inside. What a gorgeous home you have." "Thank you," I stammered, trying to collect myself. "Please, come in." I showed them around the first floor, rattling off all the selling points I'd rehearsed 100 times. Original hardwood floors, spacious eat-in kitchen, wood-burning fireplace. They oohed and ahed appropriately as I led them from room to room. "So, 4 bedrooms upstairs?" Mrs. Benson asked, as we climbed up to the second story. "3, I corrected automatically, but as I glanced down the hallway, my stomach dropped. 4 doors stood in a neat little row. 4. That impossible room had returned. "Oh yes, right this way," I heard myself saying, steering them hastily to the master suite at the end of the hall. Anything to get them away from that ominous 4th door. The tour continued without incident, and soon the Bensons were thanking me and promising to be in touch. I smiled and waved as they drove off, a cold sweat dampening my collar. The moment they were out of sight, I turned back to that impossible room, but it had vanished. Just an ordinary upstairs hallway remained, exactly as it had always been. In a daze, I finished locking up and drove home. That night I tossed and turned, unable to shake the uncanny events of the day. It had to be stress, I reasoned. Grief playing tricks on my mind. By morning light, I had half convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. But when I arrived at 611 Oakwood for the next showing, a new shock awaited me. Taped to the "For Sale" sign was a newspaper article, fluttering in the breeze. "Local couple found dead," the headline screamed. A picture of the Bensons smiled out from underneath. With a shaking hand I snatched the paper and scanned the columns. "Discovered in the basement of an uninhabited house. Cause of death unknown. Doors locked from the inside." The article slipped from my numb fingers. It couldn't be. It was impossible. They had only set foot in this house yesterday, bright-eyed and brimming with plans. Now they were gone, just like that woman before them. My mind reeled as I struggled to make sense of it all, but one thought crystallized with dreadful clarity. I couldn't let anyone else into this house. Something was very, very wrong here. I had to stop the showings, take it off the market, before anyone else got hurt. But as I marched resolutely up the driveway, I noticed something else that made me stop dead in my tracks. There, in one of the front windows, a face gazed down at me. Not just any face, my mother's face. But it wasn't quite her. The features were unnaturally pale, the eyes sunken and pleading. As I watched in horror, a gnarled hand reached up and slowly drew the curtain closed. Everything after that was a blur. Police sirens, yellow tape, muffled voices and probing questions I could barely bring myself to answer. In my dazed state, only one clear thought reverberated through my skull. This house. It wasn't done with me yet. That was 3 weeks ago. The "For Sale" sign still stands out front, swaying in the autumn breeze. But the showings have stopped. The realtors' calls have ceased. Only I remain, wandering the halls of my childhood home in a foggy trance, wondering how it will end. Last night, as I lay sleepless in my old bedroom, I heard it. A creak of a floorboard, the muffled scrape of a door. Footsteps in the hall, slow, shuffling. Drawing closer, I squeezed my eyes shut and pulled the covers tighter. It's just the house settling, I told myself, old pipes creaking. But I knew better. It's standing in the doorway now, watching me. I don't dare look, but I can feel it. The icy prickle on the back of my neck. That cold, musty smell seeping into the room. I've finally figured it out, you see. Why all those people were found locked in the basement. Why the walls seem to shift when I'm not looking. Why I sometimes catch a whiff of Mom's perfume when I know I'm alone. I don't think I ever really left this house. I'm beginning to suspect I never will. More rooms just keep appearing, you see. The hallways stretch longer. Doors that lead nowhere. It's growing, spreading, swallowing me whole. Piece by piece. memory by memory. I'm a part of it now, this house, this living, breathing thing trapping wayward souls like flies in honey. I know that now. And the truly horrifying part, the part that wakes me sweat-drenched and screaming night after night. I think a part of me is glad to be home here with whatever is left of her, with all of them, in this house that will never let me go. I guess Mom got her wish in the end. Her little boy never leaving home. Forever and ever. So if you're reading this, consider it a warning. Don't come here. Don't even look for me. Forget about the house on Oakwood Drive. Let it rot. Let it sink back into the earth from whence it came, with me inside it. I suspect I've been here all along. Hold your breath, because the next story will leave you gasping for more. As a food critic, I'm always on the hunt for hidden culinary gems. That's what brought me to the tiny rural town of Millfield. In its heyday, Millfield was a thriving agricultural hub, but as farms struggled and families moved away, the town began a slow decline. These days, it barely registers a blip on the map. I heard about Millfield from another critic who raved about an unassuming diner there serving up meals to die for. Literally, he said with a wink, I had to see for myself. Driving down the barren country road into town, Millfield looked like a forgotten relic of a bygone era. Peeling paint, boarded-up storefronts, overgrown yards. Only the neon sign of Joe's Diner pierced the gloomy dusk. A bell jingled as I stepped inside the diner. It was like entering a time warp from the 1950s. Checkered floors, vinyl booths, the scent of grease and coffee. Only a few patrons dotted the counter, all appearing to be weathered locals. Their eyes followed me suspiciously as I slid into a booth. A matronly waitress in a pink uniform hustled over, coffee pot in hand. You must be that big city food writer, she said, pouring a cup without asking. I'm Flo, welcome to Joe's. Trust me, honey, you ain't never had a meal like you're about to have. I perused the laminated menu. The dishes were classics: meatloaf, pork chops, fried chicken, burgers. But each had a unique twist, like Mildred's meatloaf or Sheriff Buck's bacon burger. What's the story behind the names? I asked. Flo gave a tight smile. Oh, just some folks who've been real special to this town over the years. Near and dear to our hearts. Joe likes commemorating them. I ordered the pork chop special with a side of green beans. As I waited, I overheard two men at the counter talking in low voices. Another one this week. That's 3 this month alone, muttered one. Travelers, outsiders. No one to miss them, said the other. The town's gotta eat. When my meal arrived, the pork chops were the most succulent I'd ever tasted. Juicy, flavorful, melt-in-your-mouth tender. But something about them seemed strangely familiar. I just couldn't put my finger on it. Over the next few days, I worked my way through Joe's menu. The meatloaf, the burgers, the fried chicken. Each dish was more mouth-watering than the last, and each seemed uncannily recognizable, like a long-forgotten memory dancing on the tip of my tongue. Meanwhile, I noticed some peculiar things about Millfield. Despite the town's apparent decay, the residents had a glow about them, high color in their cheeks, spring in their steps, almost as if they were aging in reverse. And though I saw a few outsiders, missing persons flyers peppered the telephone poles, bearing the faces of travelers who had last been seen passing through. With a gnawing unease, I began connecting the dots. The names of the dishes, honoring townsfolk near and dear. The familiar taste of the meats, unlike any pork or beef I knew. The missing visitors, the backwards aging locals, the furtive whispers of, the town's gotta eat. Dear God, I thought, this can't be real. But the truth was staring me in the face. By my final day in Millfield, only one dish remained on Joe's menu that I hadn't tried: Rachel's ribs. My blood froze as Flo set the plate before me, a wicked gleam in her eye. A face I knew all too well stared back from the missing persons flyer slipped under the door. The choice was clear but grim. Skip town and expose Millfield's horror, knowing no one would believe me, or stay and become a permanent part of the menu. You might want to leave the lights on for this next one. Trust me. I've been a portrait painter for over 30 years now. It's a dying profession in this age of digital photography and AI-generated art. Sittings that used to take weeks are now expected in a matter of hours. People just don't have the patience anymore for the delicate process of translating a human likeness onto canvas. But I've always found something magical about it, capturing a person's essence, their inner light, with each meticulous brushstroke, conveying the depth of the soul through pigments of oil and tempera. There's an intimacy to it, an unspoken bond between artist and subject. So when the Blackwood family reached out with a lucrative commission to paint a series of ancestral portraits for their estate, I eagerly accepted. Established old money families like theirs were my bread and butter. They still appreciated the prestige and tradition of a classically painted portrait. On a drizzly Tuesday morning, I arrived at Blackwood Manor, my portable easel and paints in tow. A austere butler led me inside the cavernous foyer, our footsteps echoing off the marble. Lining the walls were dramatic portraits going back generations, their eyes following me as I walked past. "You come highly recommended, Mr. Hayes," said a silvery voice. Vivian Blackwood emerged from the shadowy recesses, an elegant woman in her 60s with coiffed hair and a string of pearls. Her chiseled cheekbones and piercing eyes gave her an ageless, almost preternatural beauty. "We have quite an ambitious project in mind, a portrait of every Blackwood ancestor whose likeness has been lost to time, reincarnated through your gifted hands. You'll have our family records and estate archives at your disposal, of course." "I'm honored, Mrs. Blackwood. I'll do my best to capture the essence of your forebears." She smiled, satisfied, and led me into the library. Bookshelves soared to the raftered ceilings. Antique furniture, flickering gas lamps, and the faint scent of sandalwood gave it the feeling of stepping back in time. "You'll be working primarily in here. We've already had the archival materials and references pulled for you." She gestured to a large wooden desk heaped with yellowed documents, tintypes, and daguerreotypes of severe-looking men and women in Victorian garb. "I'll leave you to it then. Peters will be at your disposal should you need anything." I thanked her and set to work sorting through the archival materials. Using the tintypes as references, I began sketching out the first portrait, Thaddeus Blackwood, shipping magnate, 1843,1909. As I sketched, a strange tingling began creeping up the back of my neck, as if I was being watched. But I was alone in the library. I chalked it up to my imagination, fueled by the eerie atmosphere, and continued my work. By the end of the day, I had a good likeness of old Thaddeus blocked in. Exhausted but pleased with my progress, I packed up my supplies, bid Peters good night, and headed home. The next morning in my studio, I pulled out my paints, ready to start adding color to Thaddeus's portrait. But something about the pigments didn't look quite right. The burnt sienna had an odd sheen to it, almost iridescent, and the ivory black was flecked with tiny impurities. I'd have to send a complaint to my art supplier. I shrugged and began mixing the colors on my palette. As I brought the brush to canvas, a shock jolted through my hand as if I'd touched a live wire. Perturbed, I examined my brush for a frayed wire or something to explain the sensation. Finding nothing, I took a deep breath and touched my brush to the canvas again. This time, the pigment flowed like quicksilver, swirling and dancing across the canvas as if with a life of its own. Soon, a perfect, almost photorealistic image of Thaddeus Blackwood emerged, his piercing eyes, his aquiline nose, the slight sneer of his lip. It was the best portrait I'd ever painted. It practically breathed on the canvas. Elated but unnerved, I sat back to examine my handiwork. A cold sweat prickled my brow. Suddenly, Thaddeus's eyes shifted to look directly at me. I yelped and knocked over my easel in alarm, but when I looked again, the portrait remained still, lifeless. Just paint on canvas. Get a hold of yourself, Will. You're losing it. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into the Blackwood project. Each day, alone in that cavernous library, I'd pore over the family records, gleaning what I could from faded birth certificates and terse obituaries, sketching their likenesses in charcoal, then bringing them to life in oil paints that shimmered strangely in the gaslight. With each completed portrait, the Blackwood ancestors seemed to gain corporeality, their eyes following me around the room. At night, I'd jolt awake from dreams of them beckoning to me from gilt frames. I told myself it was just the power of suggestion, that I was projecting the Blackwood's dark mythos onto the paintings, but I couldn't shake the sense that I was a conduit for something otherworldly, that with each brushstroke I was resurrecting more than just their images. Vivian was elated with the portraits. Her praise bordered on ebullient. "Why, Mr. Hayes, it's as if you've reached through the veil of time and plucked my ancestors from the ether. I feel I could speak to them. We're so pleased with your work, we'd like to extend your commission. All of the Blackwood portraits, as far back as our line goes. You'll be a wealthy man." I hesitated, a chill rippling through me despite the fire crackling in the hearth. Every instinct screamed to politely decline, to get far away from Blackwood Manor and never look back. But I thought of the prestige, the money, my fading relevance as a portrait artist. I'd be honored, Mrs. Blackwood. After that, I practically lived at the manor, taking my meals in the library as I painted 12, 14, 16 hours a day. My brushes flew across the canvases in a frenzy. With each portrait, my unease grew, along with a clawing dread. I'd hear snatches of conversation drifting from the frames when the house was silent. Cruel, sibilant whispers that scraped my nerves raw. At first, just a susurrus, but rising in volume and clarity the more portraits I added to the walls. Strangest of all, the Blackwoods themselves seemed to be changing. Vivian, her husband Charles, their 2 grown children. With each passing week, they moved with more vitality, their skin glowing almost translucent, their eyes sparkling with uncanny youth, while I in turn grew more haggard, feeling the life force draining out of me as I communed with the dead through oil and canvas. My hands trembled, my sight blurred, yet still I painted like a man possessed. Because I was, in a way, what I was birthing on the canvas had taken hold of me, parasitically, and wouldn't release me until its dark work was done. One night, slumped over a snifter of brandy after a punishing day of painting, I spilled some onto one of the portraits. As I frantically dabbed at it with my handkerchief, the paint smeared, revealing a glint of something pale beneath. Hands shaking, I rubbed away more of the paint to reveal bones, human bones, pulverized into the pigment. The burnt sienna of their skin, the lamp black of their hair, the cracked and aged ivory of their teeth. All the Blackwood portraits, painted with the remains of their subjects. Reeling back in horror, I knocked into the bookshelf behind me. A sheaf of papers fluttered out from between some loose books. Curious, I smoothed out the pages to find a series of handwritten notes dated back to the early 1800s. The rituals are complete. As the final portrait dries, I feel the transferal of vitae from subject to painting to self. Eternal youth, eternal life, the Blackwood curse and blessing all in one. We ascend, they descend. There were news clippings, too. Brief obituaries for 6 artists who had gone missing or been institutionalized after accepting commissions with the Blackwoods, all their paintings lost in tragic fires. And beneath it all, a small Polaroid, dated last year, an elderly man, stooped and liver-spotted, standing proudly beside a newly completed portrait. His portrait, for it was the spitting image of him, or rather what he would become. I recognized those piercing eyes, that aquiline nose. It was the most recent portrait I had painted, but this man was no distant ancestor. This was Gregory Blackwood, Vivian's father. "Died of a sudden wasting disease earlier this year," she had said. With mounting dread, I began pulling books from the shelves. Not books at all, but cleverly disguised boxes. And inside them, Polaroids of each artist as they would be, each in front of their final portrait. And behind the photos of all the others was one more, still undeveloped. I didn't have to look to know whose face would slowly appear as the chemicals reacted. I felt it in my aching joints, my spotty vision, the clumps of hair that came out with each pass of my comb. Because there was one portrait left to paint in the collection, the one Vivian had commissioned as a surprise, to celebrate the completion of my work, my own. The one that would hang in the library as I took my place in the family plot, my bones crushed into pigment, my blood mixed into oils, my soul bound to the canvas as the blackwoods drank in my life force with every passing glance. I had to get out, to escape, but already my knees buckled, my heart fluttered in my withered chest. The siren call of the portrait, still incomplete in my studio, pulled at me with a vicious insistence. "Finish it," a voiceless whisper demanded. "Complete the ritual, seal the pact." With the last of my strength, I hurled my oil lamp at the portraits and stumbled from the room as they went up like kindling. The whoosh of flames, the screech of the blackwoods as they came pounding down the stairs, the smell of burning canvas and bone and sins long buried. I ran until my legs gave out in the woods, far from the inferno that lit the night sky behind me. But even as I collapsed into the loam, I felt it, the pull to return, to pick up the brush, to rejoin my subjects in pigment and madness, to become one with the curse that had claimed us all, because there's no release from the portrait's call. Even now, as I cough up blackened blood onto the pages of this confession, I can feel it reeling me back in, my hands itching for the bristles of the brush. No, the work of the Blackwood portrait artist is never done. We are bound to them, inextricably, our fates painted in the colors of damnation. So perhaps this is not so much a confession as it is an invitation, a morbid want ad of sorts, because once I am gone, they will need a new artist to take up the commission. It's a prestigious project, painting such a prominent family. The pay is quite good. They'll have you set up in the library. You'll have access to all their family records and archives. Paints and canvases provided, of course. They spare no expense. And the Blackwoods, they're beautiful subjects. So vivacious, so timeless, almost unnaturally so. But I must warn you, the work, it'll consume you in ways you can't possibly imagine. It'll pull you in, possess you, until you can't tell the difference between the paint and your own blood. Because that's the thing about portrait painting. It captures more than just a likeness. It captures a life, traps a soul. The Blackwood painters, we know this better than anyone. We've become our art, and the art has become us. So step up, take my place at the easel, inherit my curse, my blessing, my madness. But first, let me paint your portrait. I've already mixed the colors, your colors. Just a few more brush strokes, a few more details, and it'll be finished. Then I can finally rest, and you can take up the mantle. The portrait is waiting, and the Blackwoods are so eager to meet their new artist. Think the worst is over? You haven't heard the next story yet. When I accepted the position as the new choir director at St. Cecilia's Cathedral, I thought I had landed my dream job. I've always loved the grand acoustics and ornate beauty of historic churches, and St. Cecilia's pipe organ is one of the finest in the country, renowned for its hauntingly pure tones. I couldn't wait to hear my choir's voices echoing off the vaulted ceilings. But from the first practice, something felt off. The choir members had an eerie, distant look in their eyes, as if they were in a trance. Their singing was flawless, though, unnaturally, inhumanly perfect. Each voice hit the exact right note in immaculate unison, reverberating with a resonance I had never heard before. It sent chills down my spine. At the end of rehearsal, I complimented them on the breathtaking sound, but no one responded. They filed out in silence, staring straight ahead. One of the altos brushed past me, and her skin felt hard and cold, more like marble than flesh. Over the following weeks, the choir's odd behavior persisted along with their superhuman harmonizing. I pored over the ancient sheet music they were practicing from, trying to decipher its origins. The crumbling pages were written in an archaic notation I didn't recognize, and there were strange symbols in the margins, sigils that made my vision swim if I looked at them too long. I started having vivid dreams, visions of the composer who penned this music centuries ago. He was a gaunt, skeletal figure who coveted the pure voices of the young. I watched him lure singers with his hypnotic melodies, then entrap their voices in his pipe organ, where they would sing for him alone for eternity. Unnerved, I decided to investigate the organ itself. One evening, I unlocked the cabinet doors and peered inside, expecting the usual array of pipes. Instead, I found row after row of glass vessels, each one holding the shriveled remains of a human body. Their withered mouths were open in a silent scream. With mounting horror, I recognized the faces of previous choir members. In a panic, I raced to find the current singers and warn them. But I was too late. I found them in the sanctuary, standing as still as statues in front of the organ. Their transformation was almost complete. Their skin had hardened into a crystalline substance, perfectly preserved like a transparent shell. Only their mouths still moved, emitting that impossibly immaculate tone. I whirled around as I heard a discordant chord thunder from the organ. The keys depressed on their own as the ancient composer's form shimmered into view. He faced me and grinned, his rotting teeth bared in triumph. With a shock, I understood his plan. He was assembling the perfect choir, you see, collecting voices like instruments to play his great opus, the song that would crack open the gates of hell. The choir members weren't just singing in tune, they were becoming the organ pipes incarnate, living vessels to channel his infernal symphony for all eternity. I tried to run, to scream for help, but the music swelled around me, freezing my limbs and my voice. I could feel my own flesh start to harden as the sound waves vibrated through my bones. The final note was coming, the ultimate crescendo heralding the end of the world and beyond. And we would all have a front-row seat to the performance. My last thought as my eyes crystallized in their sockets was a desperate prayer that the song would end, that the composer would release his choir after our final command performance. But in my transfigured heart, I knew the terrible truth. There is no intermission in hell, no curtain call or exit stage left. We are forever trapped in his masterpiece, the purest voices in his perfect chord, preserved for all time to sing our screams for his pleasure alone. No one will ever find us. The cathedral will crumble to dust around our frozen frames, and still we will sing, the chord never resolving, the final note never coming. An eternal choir hidden in plain sight, invisible to the world. So next time you marvel at the celestial tones of a practiced choir, listen closer. That perfect harmony you hear might be the echo of hell in the hollows of their crystallized throats. The purest voices singing the song that never ends. Just when you thought it was safe, the next story proves otherwise. It was just another substitute teaching gig, or so I thought when I took the job at Fairfield Academy. The fancy private school needed someone to cover an extended absence, and the money was too good to pass up. Little did I know the nightmare I was walking into. The old stone buildings looked like something out of Dead Poets Society, all ivy-covered walls and gargoyle-topped columns. My first day, the headmaster gave me a cursory tour, handed me a stack of textbooks, and wished me luck. I found my classroom, took a deep breath, and waited for the bell. The students filed in quietly, designer uniforms crisp and postures perfect. They looked like little adults, all poised and eerily well-behaved. I introduced myself as Mr. Miller. 30 pairs of eyes stared back at me, devoid of any typical teenage boredom or mischief. I launched into the lesson plan, surprised by their rapt attention. They answered every question, hung on my every word. Teaching them was almost too easy. The eagerness was a little creepy, to be honest, like they were hungry for something more than knowledge. A few days in, I started noticing odd things. Conversations would hush when I entered the lounge. The other teachers, all much older than I expected, would shoot me strange looks before forcing smiles, like they knew something I didn't. Then there were the students. They never gossiped or goofed off, never checked their phones or passed notes, just stared ahead with a focus that seemed almost predatory. I convinced myself I was imagining things. They were just dedicated scholars, right? But I couldn't shake the feeling in my gut that something was very wrong. As the weeks passed, it got weirder. The students' work was perfect, too perfect. Essays with doctoral-level insights, solved proofs not even I could follow. And they were changing, aging before my eyes. Bright young faces turned gaunt, eyes sunk in dark circles, joints stiffened, shoulders stooped. They moved like people 3 times their age. Aside from the academics, they showed no interests or personality. Prodding them to discuss music, movies, friends, anything, led nowhere. They'd just smile those unnerving smiles and wait for me to continue the lesson. I'd never felt so unsettled. My unease grew. I was exhausted all the time. The classroom left me drained, like the lectures were siphoning my very life force. Probably just stress and overwork, I told myself. But my gut said that was a lie. One night, I stayed late to catch up on grading. The school was dark and silent as I walked to my room, footsteps echoing too loud. I froze at a flicker of shadow in the hall. It almost looked like, but that was crazy. Trick of the light. I hurried to the classroom, eager to be done and get out of there. Except my key didn't work. The lock was jammed. I rattled the handle in frustration. Then I heard it, a whisper threading from under the door, inhuman and guttural, a susurration of malice and hunger swelling until the very walls seemed to pulse with it. I stumbled back, heart pounding. This was insane. I was losing it. I spun to flee and found myself face to face with the headmaster. He smiled, but it didn't reach his ancient eyes. "Working late, Mr. Miller?" he hissed. "How commendable." I sputtered some excuse and got out of there, his gaze boring into my back. I raced home, trying to convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing. But I dreamed of that voice, that whisper, calling me back, seeping into my very marrow. I called in sick the next day, and the day after that. I needed to clear my head. But staring at my ceiling, all I could think of were those students, their unnatural focus, their decrepit faces. I had to know the truth. I went back on the third day, early enough to avoid seeing anyone. I had a plan. I headed to the creepy old basement archives, determined to find records of past long-term subs. The place was ancient, all cobwebs and dust and shadows that seemed to reach for me. I combed the shelves with mounting dread. Most of the files were mundane, budgets and tax forms, but tucked in the back, a rusted cabinet held crumbling teacher records. The subs before me, all young and bright-eyed in their photos, hired for extended terms and then gone. Scribbled notes about sudden departures, no forwarding info, a litany of promising careers that dead-ended at Fairfield Academy. As I rifled deeper, I found personal effects, coffee cups, cardigans, photos, relics of the vanished entombed in this basement. With growing horror, I realized the items were repeats of things I'd brought to class myself. The same color jacket, the same edition textbook, like I was just another duplicate, plugged into their sinister curriculum. I didn't hear the footsteps until it was too late. I whirled, but iron hands seized my shoulders. The headmaster, grinning like a skull in the dark. I struggled, but his grip was inhuman. He shoved me against the cabinet, breath foul. "Leaving so soon, Mr. Miller," he crooned. "But you have so much more to give." I babbled and fought, but he just laughed. "You're catching on quicker than the others. Cleverer. You'll last longer." That's when the students emerged from the shadows. Emaciated figures in tattered uniforms, limbs angular and eyes glinting red. They surrounded me, greedy hands grasping. Their whispers swelled in a dark chorus. That same guttural hum. I screamed. The headmaster shoved a book into my hands, the confiscated textbook from my desk. "It's hungry, Mr. Miller. Time to feed it." The tome fell open, pages pristine. It pulled my gaze into the swimming symbols, down and down into some lunatic abyss. I felt my essence flow out of me, siphoning into the pages, into the fiendish figures all around. Youth and vitality, the precious font of life, consumed by their hungering maws. With fading strength I looked up at the students, withered mockeries of children. This is what they truly were, ancient things, glutted on stolen life force. Trapped in this school, this ceremony, this feeding that never ended. And now it was my turn to join the faculty. Darkness took me, dragging me into their cursed ranks. I awoke at my desk, dressed in a crisp sport coat and tie. The students waited, bland smiles on corpse-like faces. My class list sat before me, names repeating into infinity. Trapped, just like me. I picked up the textbook, a well of endless need. I would teach, and I would feed. It was the only way. The young would matriculate in, bright and shining and new, Lambs to a slaughter with no visible blade. After all, isn't that the point of a good education? Passing on knowledge to the next generation, preparing them for what's to come. I understand now. This is my calling, my penance. The bell rings, and they file in, another year, another crop, full of delicious life. I smile, and it all begins again. If you're still here, brace yourself. Things are about to get even more unsettling. I've always found comfort in quilting. It's my way to socialize, to create, to leave a small legacy of warmth and beauty behind. When I retired to Sunnyside Senior Community last year, I was thrilled to discover they had a quilting circle. The ladies welcomed me with open arms, especially Margaret Wilson, the head of the group. From the start, Margaret took me under her wing, teaching me patterns and techniques I'd never tried before. Our latest project was a special community quilt, with each member contributing unique blocks to be stitched together. Margaret said it was a long-standing tradition, a way for Sunnyside to weave itself closer. I dove in eagerly, spending long hours perfecting my patchwork squares. But as the weeks went by, I noticed something odd. Members who submitted their blocks to Margaret would often disappear from the group, one by one. When I asked after them, Margaret would smile sadly and say they had other obligations, now that their part was complete. Still, I pressed on, determined to prove myself. Late one night, as I was finishing my section, I noticed a strange pattern emerging in the quilt top. The blocks seemed to form a kind of map, with winding paths, green spaces, and names embroidered like little headstones. Familiar names. With a chill, I realized they matched the missing members. Hands shaking, I laid out the unfinished quilt on the rec room floor. As I traced the patchwork map, a horrifying idea began to take shape. Each segment seemed to correspond to a section of the Sunnyside grounds. The gardens, the courtyard, the cemetery. The map was dotted with X's that marked where the vanished quilters might be buried. Heart-pounding, I rifled through the storage cupboards, pulling out older quilts. I examined them frantically, and sure enough, I found the same unsettling motifs, the same cryptic charts of Sunnyside stitched in loving detail, with new names added each year. The truth hit me like an icy flood. These weren't just quilts, they were guides to a secret graveyard, records of a grim ritual. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't go to the police with a half-mad theory based on a blanket. I needed more proof, so I stayed up all night, studying the quilts, trying to decipher the secret behind the stitches. As dawn crept in, I was interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Margaret, smiling her grandmotherly smile. "You're up early, dear, and look how much you've finished. I knew you'd be a dedicated addition to our little group." I stammered something about wanting to get an early start, but she cut me off with a gentle cluck of her tongue. Now, you've been working too hard. Why don't you join me for some tea? I have a special blend reserved for our most talented members." Alarm bells clamored in my head, but I didn't know how to refuse without making her suspicious. Against every instinct, I let her lead me to her apartment. I perched on her sofa, hands knotted in my lap, as she bustled about the kitchen, brewing a fragrant pot of tea. She poured me a cup, but as her hand passed before my eyes, I noticed something I'd never seen before, a stippling of needle scars, old and faded, all over her fingers and palms. The icy dread spread through my veins. She must have seen it in my face. Her kindly mask slipped just for a second, and something ancient and cold looked out from her eyes. "Is everything all right, dear? You look a bit peaked." I leaped up, knocking over my tea. I stammered a hurried apology and fled. I thought I heard Margaret calling after me, but I didn't stop. I raced out of the building, gasping the crisp morning air in desperate gulps. The next day, I slipped a letter under Margaret's door, claiming a family emergency had called me away. But in truth, I was hiding in my apartment, jumping at every noise, convinced Margaret would come for me. It's been a week now. No one has come knocking, not Margaret or the other quilters. But I'm haunted by the knowledge I've uncovered. I keep going over the quilt maps in my mind, trying to understand their full meaning. I think back to the hushed reverence the ladies had for Margaret, the strange power she seemed to hold, and those scars on her hands. I shudder to imagine how she got them. or how many quilts she's made, how many sunny-side souls she's bound up in thread and fabric, trapped behind needlepoint headstones. Is that how this place has stayed so vibrant, so untouched by time? I don't have answers, only fears that fester like an infected wound. So I keep to myself, trying to lose myself in books, in TV, anything to drown out the dread. But at night, I swear I can hear it. A faint rustling, a fluttering of cloth. I tell myself it's just the curtains, but in my heart, I wonder if the quilts are restless, if the spirits stitched into them are stirring, pacing the halls, reaching for me with phantom fingers. Part of me wants to run, to leave this all behind, and part of me is drawn to the unfinished quilt, to the empty space in its center that calls out for one more square, one more sacrificial patch to lock the pattern in place. I have a feeling it's a space meant only for me, and if I don't fill it, it will be filled for me, one stitch at a time. The last story was creepy, but this one? It will stay with you long after it's over. I've been selling seasonal produce at the Millfield Farmers Market for nearly a decade. It's a quaint little operation, a dozen or so stalls huddled under white canopies, peddling everything from heirloom tomatoes to small batch maple syrup. I've always loved the market's friendly, community vibe, at least during the day. You see, the market doesn't really close at dusk like the signs say. Once the last customer wanders off and the vendors pack up for the night, that's when the real market begins. The night market, we call it. And what's for sale in those midnight hours? Well, let's just say it ain't fruits and veggies. It started innocently enough. I was running late breaking down my stall one evening a few years back. As I finished stacking my crates, I noticed a shadowy gathering at the far end of the lot. Curious, I walked over. The other vendors were reopening their booths, but now they were hawking some mighty peculiar wares. Jenna, the lady who normally sold artisan jams, had jars of dark liquid that definitely wasn't preserves. Sip the life force of the innocent, she called with a wicked grin. Guaranteed to keep you young. At the next table, Bill, an heirloom pumpkin farmer by day, was weighing a pair of eerily glowing eyes on a brass scale. Plucked fresh from our most meddlesome customers, he cackled. See into the beyond. I stumbled away, my mind reeling. Was this some kind of sick joke? A hidden camera prank? But as I watched, eager customers slunk from the shadows, perusing the macabre merchandise. And they paid not with cash, but blood, making small cuts on their palms and letting the crimson droplets splatter onto silver trays. The vendors smiled ghoulishly. Shaking, I ran to my truck and peeled out of the lot. I told myself it was some bizarre shared delusion. I just needed sleep. But the next morning, I couldn't resist going back. The market looked completely ordinary in the daylight. No sign of the previous night's horrors. I started to wonder if I had dreamed the whole thing. That is, until dusk fell again, and the night market reopened its terrible trade. This time, I was swept into its surreal currents. The other vendors eagerly waved me over, as if they had expected my return all along. Jenna grabbed my elbow, her eyes feverish. "Danny boy," she crowed, "ready to embrace your true calling?" "My what?" I sputtered. "What is all this? What's going on here?" Bill stepped out of the shadows, chuckling coldly. "What does it look like? Fulfilling the needs of our most devoted customers." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss. "Providing them the chance to taste the hidden delicacies of the cosmos, to obtain power beyond mortal imagining. For the right price, of course." I shook my head frantically. "This is insane," I croaked. "You're insane. I want no part of this." "Oh, but you will," Jenna purred. "We all do in the end. The true market demands it. Where do you think the previous vendors went? Why do you think there are always openings at the market each season?" Her laugh was like nails on a chalkboard. I looked around wildly. The customers filing between the stalls no longer seemed human. Their eyes glinted red in the moonlight. Shadows writhed around them like living things. And was it my imagination? Or were some of the items for sale moving? Heart hammering, I wrenched away from Jenna's grasp and bolted for the street. Their mocking laughter echoed after me. I ran until my lungs burned, until the night market was far behind me. When I finally stopped, gasping, I looked at my watch. It was nearly 2 a.m. I had been there for hours, but it had felt like mere minutes. Since that night, I haven't set foot in the market again. I quit my stall the very next day, but I can still feel it, calling to me. Every night at midnight, a ghostly impulse tugs at my mind, tempting me to return, to claim my place among its twisted vendors, to sell the unspeakable to those hungry for a taste of darkness. Sometimes, I'll drive by the market after the sun sets, just to prove to myself that it's not real. But I can see them in the shadows, the eager customers, the grinning vendors, peddling their wares that should not be. And I know it's only a matter of time before the market claims me too, before I join their abhorrent ranks for good. There's a stall with my name on it, you see. In the night market, they're always hiring. They're always hungry for fresh meat like you and me. So next time you're picking up a quart of heirloom tomatoes, be sure you're gone by dusk. Stay far away from the shadows at the edge of the lot. No matter what you hear, no matter how it calls to that secret, savage part of your soul. Because in the night market, everyone's a vendor in the end, and the currency is blood. Don't relax just yet, this next story might be the scariest of them all. I've always loved old theaters. There's just something magical about them, you know? The history, the architecture, the way they transport you to another world. So when I got the chance to lead the restoration of the abandoned Orpheum Theater downtown, I jumped at it. Sure, the place was in rough shape. It had been shuttered for decades, ever since a string of strange accidents back in the 1930s. But I was convinced with some TLC, we could bring the Grand Dame back to her former glory. The first few weeks went smoothly. My crew worked hard, clearing out cobwebs and debris, repairing crumbling plaster, polishing up the ornate woodwork. But then we started hearing things. It began with Robert, one of my most reliable guys. He was working late one night, finishing up repainting the stage floor. The next morning, he turned up missing. We searched high and low, but it was like he vanished into thin air. I reported it to the police, of course. They poked around but didn't find any leads. Probably figured Robert had just walked off the job, but I knew better. He loved this project as much as I did. Then it happened again, and again. Every week or so, another member of my team would disappear, always at night, always without a trace. Whispers started flying around the crew, talk of ghosts and curses. I tried to stamp it out, to keep everyone focused, but even I couldn't deny the unease slithering down my spine. Late one evening, I was going over blueprints in my makeshift office. The rest of the crew had gone home hours ago. As I pored over the faded plans, a detail I'd never noticed before caught my eye. Dotted lines indicating a space below the main stage, a sub-basement, unaccounted for on any of the other drawings. Heart pounding, I grabbed a flashlight and crept down to the stage. Up close, I could see it, a trapdoor, nearly invisible beneath decades of grime. It took all my strength to pry it open. A musty puff of air escaped, carrying the scent of something long forgotten. I lowered myself into the hole, my beam of light feeble against the pressing dark. The space opened up into a low-ceilinged room directly beneath the stage. Faded posters clung to mildewed walls. Rows of rickety wooden chairs faced a crude proscenium. As I took another step, the trapdoor slammed shut above me. I whirled, heart in my throat, and then I heard it, the unmistakable swell of applause, echoing from those empty seats. Growing louder, more frenzied, dust motes swirled in the beam of my flashlight, disturbed by phantom hands clapping. From the wings of this macabre second stage, figures began to shuffle out, pale, translucent, clad in moldering vaudeville finery. Their mouths gaped in silent laughter as they took their positions, jerking through the motions of some yesteryear routine. With dawning horror, I recognized the faces. Robert, Anne, Marcus, all my missing crew members, now consigned to an eternal performance. Stumbling backwards, my elbow knocked into a piece of scenery, but it wasn't made of plywood and paint. The sickening give of skin and bone. I choked back a scream. A bony hand clamped my shoulder. I spun to see a gaunt figure, grinning skull-like in a tattered top hat. "Welcome, my dear," he rasped. "We've been waiting for a new stage manager." I wrenched away, hurling myself at the door. By some miracle it flew open. I hauled myself out, not stopping until I'd staggered into the cool night air, gulping panicked breaths. The police think I'm crazy. They searched the sub-basement and found nothing, just an empty room. But I know what I saw, and I can't shake the feeling that final act is still waiting for its cue. I quit the restoration, handed it off to some other poor soul. But part of me will always be trapped there, in that theater far below, waiting in the wings. Some stories are spooky, but this next one, it's downright haunting. I never wanted to run an apple orchard. It wasn't exactly my idea of an exciting career. But when my great-uncle Alistair passed away last fall, I found out he'd left the whole operation to me in his will. And so, at the ripe age of 28, I traded my studio apartment and barista apron for a farmhouse and 10 sprawling acres of gnarled apple trees in the middle of nowhere, Washington State. Great-uncle Alistair was always an eccentric, and I barely knew him growing up. Still, how hard could running an orchard really be? That's what I told myself as I packed up my life and made the drive out to the boonies. Looking back, I can't believe how naive I was. But then again, nothing could have prepared me for the twisted legacy waiting for me among those trees. The orchard had been in the family for generations, and the farmhouse was straight out of a Gothic novel, more Bates Motel than Cozy Cottage. But I figured some new paint and elbow grease would spruce it right up. My first weeks as the new orchard keeper flew by in a blur of pruning, painting, and paperwork. The trees were well established, and most of the apples sold to a distributor in town, so the business ran itself for the most part. I should have known it was too easy. Things started getting weird in late November. I was making my daily rounds of the orchard, checking for last-minute tasks before the first snow, when I noticed something odd. In the oldest section of the orchard, where the trees were gnarled and bent with age, the apples still clung to the branches. Most of the other trees were well picked over by now, but these were heavy with fruit, gleaming like rubies in the weak winter sun. It shouldn't have been possible. Apple season was long over. But there they were, plump and perfect, despite the frost on the ground. I plucked one and took a cautious bite. The flavor exploded on my tongue, honey-sweet and crisp as a fall morning. Soon I was eating them by the basket, overcome by gluttonous glee. I felt invigorated, energized in a way I had never experienced before. I knew right then I'd be keeping those particular trees to myself, distributor be damned. But my secretive greed backfired when some local kids, on a dare, snuck into the orchard one moonless night to rustle a few illicit snacks. I woke up to see their flashlight beams dancing between the rows. I almost called out to them, but something in the back of my lizard brain held my tongue. A compulsion, a possessive tug that wanted the apples and their forbidden sweetness all to myself. I watched the lights wink out, one by one, until only the darkness and the sounds of the forest remained. The kids never made it home that night, or the next. The whole town turned out to search. Police combed the orchard for any trace, cadaver dogs straining at their leads. They found nothing, not a single shred of evidence to suggest 5 healthy teenagers had ever set foot among the neat rows. The case went cold, and I told myself it had nothing to do with me, that children run away all the time. But then it happened again. This time, a young couple from the next town over, out for a romantic trespass under the winter moon. I saw them disappear between the trees, heard the giggles and whispers go silent. They never came out. Once again, the police found nothing, but I knew. Deep down, I knew the trees weren't done feeding. Panic gnawed at me like a rat. I had to know what was happening, what I had signed up for when I inherited this god-forsaken orchard. I pored over Alistair's records, his ledgers and journals from the long years he spent alone with only the apple trees for company. At first I found only ramblings, the prosaic musings of a country widower. But then, tucked between water-stained pages, I found it. A weathered map of the orchard with one section marked by a hatch mark and 2 words beneath: the roots. In that moment, Dread settled in my gut like a stone. The oldest trees, the ones that still bore fruit so late in the season, they grew in that marked square, their roots sunk deep in the loamy soil. Hands shaking, I grabbed a shovel and an old kerosene lantern. The moon was high and bone-white when I reached the glade. The trees shook, though there was no wind, the apples glinting like polished skulls. With every ounce of my courage, I began to dig at the base of the largest tree. The soil was wormy and loose, the night air ripe with the stench of decay. 6 feet down, my shovel struck something soft. Fabric and flesh and bone. I fell to my knees as the awful truth turned my blood to ice water. The trees, the apples, the disappearances, it all made a twisted, terrible sense. This was no ordinary orchard. I had inherited a boneyard, a mass grave where my family had fertilized the earth with stolen life. The apples weren't a miracle, they were a curse, a crop that required unthinkable sacrifice. In that moment, the terrible bargain became clear. The orchard was hungry, and it would be fed. By theft and secrecy and darkness, the ghastly ritual would continue, and I was to be its keeper, luring fresh meat to glut its roots, or else join the rotting dead beneath the boughs, until what was left of me rose through the bark as sickly sweet fruit. I filled in the hole with leaden limbs, my mind reeling, gorge rising in my throat. I had to get out, to run, to find some way to break the cycle. But even as I stumbled toward the farmhouse, I felt the orchard watching, felt its hooked branches tightening around my neck like a noose. It will never let me go, I realize now. The hunger is in my bones, my blood. The curse lives in me. So I sit here, in this house that no longer feels like home, and I stare out at the moonlit rows that rustle and whisper with a terrible impatience. I dare not sleep. The apples gleam like rubies on the branch, swollen with the sins of my fathers. Soon, I know, I must harvest. I must feed the roots, or join them in the dark earth. There is no escape from the obligations of blood and hunger. If you're reading this, I pray you stay far from these trees and their secrets. Don't follow the lights in the orchard, or be tempted by the fruit that ripens out of time. Walk quickly past this house, and spare no glance for the faded figure in the window, the orchard keeper with death in his eyes and a basket on his arm. I am not to be saved. I am only hollow bones and the memory of sweetness on my tongue, bound to my purpose until the orchard swallows me whole.